How you doing?
I'm doing good. I was kind of a little worried because I have guinea pigs and they usually sleep during the day and I'm watching them. They're quiet now, but
Okay.
like
You
there have
reckon they're
been
gonna kick off?
so they love chewing at the cage. Even though I give them plenty of toys to chew with, they
Right.
choose to chew on the cage. I'm like, okay, that's great.
Yeah, that's an
So I think
interesting life choice.
yeah, so like they're fine now, I think. But yeah, that was one of my things when I left um the faith in my family was that I never had pets growing up.
Okay.
So I was like, I'm getting because I've wanted a guinea pig since I was like 12. And like most people I talk to, they're like, why wouldn't you want a bunny? Like, why wouldn't you want this or that? I was like, I don't know. I've had an obsession with guinea pigs. Like, leave me alone.
That's
Okay.
hilarious. My sister had guinea pigs growing up. I don't really remember anything about them. They're basically just really big hamsters, right? I mean,
They really, yeah, that's really what they are. They're big
yeah.
hamsters.
But they're like, I feel like they're less mobile than a rabbit. I feel like a rabbit, if you leave the door open, you're in trouble. Guinea
Yeah.
pig, you leave the door open, you can catch it. You can like kind of make a quick
I
dart to the door.
you would be shocked how fast they are actually. I
Really?
live far away. I brought one of them outside just to get the sunshine and my driveway has like it's a brick wall that goes to a corner and I was like, oh, I'll put him in the corner so if he tries to run away, I can easily get him. I barely look away and he's darting towards the road and I'm like
He's Steve
running.
McQueening it straight
Yeah.
out, like Great Escape. Like,
I was like, dude, like, come on. I just got you. Don't do this.
now just picture him sitting in his cage, bouncing his tennis ball right across the wall.
And
um,
yeah, the funny thing is that I'll take their one of their cage walls off to let them walk around my room to play. And sometimes they won't even take the opportunity to just stay in their cage and not give a shit. I'm like,
that's
okay, all
so
right.
funny.
They love the
It
little
shows they like it, I guess. It's a good thing, right?
yeah, that's a good thing, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. We have that with our puppy, like she's crate trained. So she goes to her crate to like, overnight, she'll sleep in it, or when we go out for a few hours, she'll like just chill in her crate. But like
Mhm.
you do go, we call it a crate, but it's basically a cage. We put these animals in a tiny cage, but she
Yeah.
loves it in there. Like we trained her to love it in there. We give her like really high value treats when she goes in early on and
I
stuff. But like for
yeah.
her in the middle of the day, she's like, I'm gonna chill. I'm just gonna go and sit in my crate. Like I like it in there. It's cozy. It's a blanket over it. It's like I feel like I guess it's kind of like a den or something for them. Do you not get worried when you take your guinea pig outside, like that some sort of like eagle or something or an owl is just gonna swoop down and take it?
See, I did it once and like I'm very careful. Like I know guinea pigs, they do not like open areas because their
Mm,
instinct they will get eaten. So I don't
yeah.
put them in open areas at all. And like I don't bring them outside anymore. Like I learned that first time not to do that.
No,
And
you like were like that was a bit too close.
no, I was like, no, I'm like, of course, with my luck, a car would have been coming right by the exact time it
Oh
comes to the
yeah,
road, kills it. So I've actually seen they sell guinea pig leashes online, looking for your guinea pig in a harness, and it has
that's
a leash.
hilarious.
And I talked to one of my best friends. Like, we should take it to the park and walk it around. Like, they're the weirdest thing. Like, so
Wow.
walking a guinea pig in the park.
Now I'm just envisioning you having an eagle on a leash, right? I mean, like because the eagle's coming down for that guinea pig, whether it's on a leash or
That,
not,
yeah,
but
that
it
would
can't
happen.
take off, and now you're like getting dragged around by an eagle.
Yeah, I will hold on to that. Like, yeah, I love my guinea pigs, honestly. It's been
That's
good for
so
me.
funny. That's great. I love it. I think there's something really helpful about having pets. It's done me like so much
Yeah.
wonders for my mental health. It's
Mhm.
also driven me a bit insane at times. And at times I'm like, this is this helping my mental health? I feel like I'm more overwhelmed right now. But for the most part, especially after kind of the very early puppy stages, that was intense. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, no, I'm back to sleeping properly. She's pretty
Uh-huh.
chill. Yeah, this is great. I like this. I like having this
Yeah.
other being that likes you and needs you and relies.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about like having
Like
that level of
companionship.
responsibility, right?
Uh-huh.
That
Yeah.
you're like, if I don't do something, you die. And I'm like, well, I
Yeah.
guess I have to get out of bed, right? It's like, no,
I
I'm
love
gonna have to go to a shop and buy you food because if I don't, you die. Like that's a right. I mean,
yeah.
I'm sure people are. That's basically what happens when you get kids, I guess, as well. It's just like
Yeah.
that's even a whole nother level. But um,
Yes.
yeah, I need someone relying on me for me to be able to go to the shop and get food most of the time. If it was
Oh
just
wow.
me,
For
I'm like,
yourself.
I'm like, I'll just eat, frozen bread like 8 days a year, week. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Dude, I'm excited for this. This is going to be really fun.
No, I'm excited for this too, honestly. Yeah, I've watched I watched one of your or listened to one of your shows last night, and like I'll just tell you that I got triggered and I stopped listening to it, and like it's not on you, that's on me. I'm working through my shit in therapy.
Which guest was it?
It was Derek Myers with the OCD and religion. It
Mm,
was just that title intrigued me because OCD is something I've struggled with, and like to hear him and how people dismiss his mental health was triggering to me because that happened to
yeah.
me a lot. So it's like, I'm like, God, I'm like, I'm reliving this. Like, I cannot, like, because I was trying to get a feel more for the show. And like, I really love it. Like, your show is not forced. I feel like you like let the conversation go. And I feel like those are the best podcasts. I feel like they're more
Yeah.
authentic. And everything that needs to be said is like said and it goes with the flow. But because I think this is like my 7th podcast, I think, to be honest.
Nice.
So like, I have a little practice. So like in the beginning, it was really nerve-wracking, honestly. But like I don't know if you know any of my story, but like my first time to tell my story was on Joshua Harris's IGTV show, Every Story Matters.
Right. Yeah.
And it was a big moment, and like I feel like that gave me the confidence, just jumping out and doing that gave me the confidence to start sharing my story with other people, because like I knew 6 weeks in advance when I was going to be on his show, and like I'm a very organized like planning type person.
That's funny.
And so like I was like I have 30 minutes to tell my life story. How am I going to do this? Because like his show is like so short. So I was like,
Right.
so like I had to like really condense it and pick out like the main points and the main thing I wanted to talk to people about. And like the main purpose of being on the show was to talk about a photo series I worked on, because at the time I went to Bob Jones University, this super conservative, fundy Christian college in Greenville, South Carolina. And this semester was my last semester until I got kicked out back in January, and I got expelled for the interview I did with him.
Wow.
Which was something like I prepared myself for mentally, emotionally, and like I tried to do everything. I did everything I could to like block as many people as I possibly could so they wouldn't see it, before the video came out. But it was still somehow slipped through the cracks, and it was like shared a lot on campus. That I later I was like, oh,
that blows my mind. Like I can't. So this might be me in my European little high tower or something like that, but I'm like, if a university kicked you out because you went on a podcast and talked about your story, you would be able to sue them. Like you just would not be allowed to be kicked out right before you graduate, after you've plowed a whole bunch of money into them as well. And they're like, no, we're not going to let you graduate anymore because you said some stuff that we didn't like. I'm like, that's not how life works. Deal with it.
Yeah.
But it's a weird American dynamic that like
it is, most definitely.
Yeah.
And it's these private Christian colleges. Like the issue is that before you go to these universities, you sign something saying that you adhere to their beliefs or blah, blah, blah. And like you sign a thing that you will not talk about them in the media too, while you're at the school at all. And
which, by the way, red flag. Like, how do we not, like, it shows how much we have been just indoctrinated in these concepts, that we read a paper that says, I promise I will never bring up anything that happens in this university in the media. And you're like, rules are usually in something for a reason. And you go, I wonder what the reason is. And you're like, I doesn't feel like there's any particular good reason that you would want to stop people talking to the media if you're a great place, right? Yeah, only bad people say you're not allowed to tell it, right? I mean, I'm just like, unless you're designing the new iPhone, I feel like this is not okay.
Yeah. And like the struggle with the thing was, so I grew up in fundamentalist Christianity, the IFB movement, Independent Fundamental Baptist, for those who don't know what that is. And
it's a special type of wild. Like there's a Twitter account, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like, I think it's like IFB crazy or something like that. And they just get clips. just from IFB sermons, and it's honestly
Triggered.
it's so triggering and so
Yeah.
funny. And I literally, it's a dice roll every time I see a tweet from them. I'm like, I'm either going to laugh or I'm going to go and cry in a ball.
Yeah.
But it's I mean, it says exactly what the IFB is perfectly. The fact that you can have an entire tweet account dedicated to this and have regular content.
Like, I joined a Facebook group that's for like IFB/cult survivors that I just came up with, just people sharing their stories. And there are a lot of people in there from like past Bob Jones students too. And it's so interesting because I never, until I actually got access to the internet around like 16 or 17 years old, I didn't realize like how influential the people that I knew of in the IFB movement, because I went to Gospel Light Baptist Church in Walkertown, North Carolina. It was pastored by Brother Bobby Robertson for like 61 years. And he knew Jack Hyles, he knew John R. Rice, all these two big figures in the fundamentalist movement. And like IFB churches across all of America knew Brother Bobby. Like whenever I would either visit a church or go even when I got to Bob Jones, I would go to a church and I would say, yeah, I'm from Gospel Light. They're like, oh my gosh, Brother Bobby Robertson, he's like the best preacher, was an amazing Christian in the world. And I was like, oh, okay, like nice. And like there were red flags in the church definitely growing up. And like the one nice thing I'll say about Brother Bobby is that he never had any scandals whatsoever. He's one of the few relatively famous preachers who did not have any dirt on him. He was genuinely a good person, I would say. And that's, I think, really why people had such a cult-like obsession with him. And like, I'm just saying cult-like because there were red flags in my church where it was like Jesus and Brother Bobby were like on the same level almost. And my parents were like, they would sometimes just cry, just talk about how amazing he was. And my parents stayed at that church for they're still there. Like they've been there since the late 90s.
Wow.
And, Brother Bobby, he died in like 2018. And so, as I've been writing my book and looking back on all these experiences, there was one like a major red flag that blew my mind in church. It was when a church member was in the pulpit and they were praying to God and they were like, oh, dear Jesus, help us to be more like Brother Bobby. And I just thought, well, if God is real and he's listening to this, he's like, you just slapped him in the face. Like how I just can't imagine the obsession that someone would have with a person to actually pray to a God and say, help me to be more like them. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like it in that moment, I realized the unhealthy admiration that my church had for this pastor. And yes, he was a nice man. And I've even talked to my brother about this, my oldest brother, who's still in the funding movement. He was like, yeah, he's like, I don't tell people I went to that church anymore because I get so tired of hearing people go on and on about Brother Bobby. He's like, I get it. He was a nice man, but like he wasn't Jesus.
Right.
Like calm down.
It's so interesting. So I grew up in a myriad of different churches, but some of the churches I was in, I think even some of the most fundamental churches I was in like Brethren movement and things like that.
Yeah.
And in quite a few of them, I would hear that kind of rhetoric and they would use the Bible to back it. They'd be like, well, it's like Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And they would be like, well, imitate the pastor as he's imitating Christ. It's like, it's almost like the regular person can't be Christ-like, but if you're lucky, you might be as pastor-like as possible while they're being Christ-like. It's like this weird, it just kind of creates this hierarchy that we already have in place, but it's just doubling down on it, going, look, you should be trying to emulate the pastor here. We're not trying to be Christ-like here. We're trying to be pastor-like. Be like this guy, which is a weird thing. And I get it. Like, I mean, I've met people in my life that are in positions of power that I go, this person is genuinely an amazing person, and I'd like to be more like them. Like, and I think, that's life, right? We come across people and we go, God, could I be more like that person? I meet people like that all the time.
Yeah.
But it's kind of weird in the context of a religion where it's telling you not to have idols, where it's telling you to glorify nobody but God, where it's telling you to try and be Christ-like, and you're going, yeah, well, I'll try and be like my pastor, and God, please make me like. If you're going to say a prayer, right? If you go, God, please make me like, right? And he's going to answer that prayer. Just say Jesus, right? You say you. Don't go, who's the best? That guy over there. He like. Just say God if you think he's going to answer it, right? It's such a bizarre thing, but
it is.
Yeah, go for it.
And like, you know, part of it, like you were saying, is like, it's really, and it's funny because on my Instagram page, I make basically like infographics about certain topics, and like I just made one about, I call it gods in the funding movement. Because there's these, I mean, they're really gods. Like these people idolize them so much. And I kind of like delve into like pastor idolizing and how we can put these pastors on level with people's perception of what God is, at least. And the thing is, we don't know what goes on behind the scenes. Honestly, we don't know what they're doing at home. And like, there's so many scandals in the church. And like, I don't know, I think you posted or someone else about, it was something about scandals. It was like, this isn't a scandal, really. This is just church culture. And I don't know if it was you or like
I shared something yesterday. I think it was
I'm
trying to think who it was.
It was an amazing
Julia, that loud deconstructing one. I think it is.
Oh yes, I think that was it.
Is she called Julia? I don't know. The problem is with all these different people that have different handles that aren't their names. And I can't remember who's who. But it's such a good point, because it is at a certain point you go, is this like, normal organizations don't have this many scandals because they have systems in place to not do that.
Yes.
We don't. It almost feels like the systems in place allow for that. It maybe even create space for it to happen more prevalently. I don't think people intended to start a church where they would intentionally get to abuse people. Maybe some people do. But it feels like the system there, it does.
It attracts
wide open for that, and it attracts the wrong kind of people. And it's
and
weird.
Like it is. And like thinking of that, looking back at my church, I would say it was probably kept under wraps or hidden from me, but I would not be surprised if there was sexual abuse in the bus ministry at my church, because that was a big thing. Because Jack Hiles from Indiana, with his church and college, Hiles Anderson, that he started, he started the bus ministry, which is big in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And Gospel Light Baptist Church was one of the churches in America that had a huge bus ministry. I think we had to run like 50 buses that we ran. Wow. Like it was like big thing. And you know, as I got older, I was like thinking about, I'm like, do we do any background checks for the drivers that we get for these 50 buses? And we have adults, not all the time, but there are sometimes adults are alone in a room with a classroom of kids, a tiny little, it's really old, the building we would have, like at a bunch of, you would go into a big room and there would be like 3 doors on each side that had like little rooms that could fit maybe 10 people into it. And so there were all these like hidden places around. And as I got older, I realized that they didn't do background checks for people at our church, which is crazy, the day and age that we, like, if you had a pulse, they would just take you as a bus driver. And like the issue is, there's all like the church I grew up in, like at the time, I mean, right now it's like 98% of the people are 70 and over.
Wow.
So they have a completely different mindset and awareness of what the world is like. And major issues with like pedophilia and child abuse. And like, I know part of it is that you want to go to church and believe that this is going to be a safe environment away from everything else. Of course. You don't want to like be constantly on guard and for survival. Like, oh my gosh, what if this adult is dangerous? Is this, or like, there's this really awful mentality, which I noticed that once someone proclaimed that they were saved, it's like they were pure inside and out. Like, okay, you're ready to get in the ministry. You're saved. You have the Holy Spirit inside of you. Well, let's give you all these positions. It's like, no, please.
Yeah. It's a weird, it's, we love the idea that I'm in you're out. We like the idea that everyone in is good, like me. Whether I'm good or not is kind of not the point. I like to think I'm good, right? And so you can have absolute monsters think they're good. And we like to go, well, obviously it's the world that's evil. So the world has pedophilia. The world has whatever. You even see this in the Protestant church going, oh, look at the Catholics. They have pedophilia in the church. But actually the occurrences of child abuse in the Catholic church are at the same sort of percentage as the Protestant church, which is, by the way, terrifying, because that doesn't mean that the Catholic church is better than we thought. It means that we're totally moving the goalposts and trying to avoid looking at ourselves, because the Protestant church has huge amounts of child abuse and also clergy abuse in general. And so it's this weird thing that we like to look at the other person and go, they're dangerous, we're not. Why would we background check Bob? He's one of us, you know? He always walks around with his hands in his pants. Like I don't know, like you're just like, no, Bob, it's creepy. Bob's creepy. Everyone's getting creeped out by Bob.
I feel like the sad thing is we cannot judge a book by its cover. I mean, some covers are obvious, like we need to be careful discerning, but it's like there are some people that it happens, you're like, oh my gosh, I never ever thought that they would be a child abuser. And you know, because Bob Jones University, they get funds from the government, there's a requirement for every student to go through sexual abuse training or sexual aware, something like that, of being aware of signs, especially of like adults and children, of like things that might not, people think, oh, well, that's inappropriate, but like just beginning signs of how an adult might start to groom a child, because that's the day and the age that we live in. And you know, I was talking with a friend last night and he was like, listen, he's like, the sad thing is, he's like, wherever there are adults and children, there are issues of pedophilia all across, in our schools, in our churches, in our daycares. Like it is like a systemic issue that, you know, is throughout this. Like I recently found out that like the United States is like the biggest consumer of child pornography. And that just breaks my heart so much. And it makes me angry because we have all these Christians focusing on these other issues that really don't matter, when there is this massive thing that no one wants to talk about. I'm like, why aren't Christians speaking up against pedophilia? And I'm like, they're over here trying to take away rights from gay people, but they don't want to talk about the abusers in their churches and in these systems. And it's just, and the thing is, it's so uncomfortable. It's such an uncomfortable topic. And like I was talking with the family I live with, it was a few days ago, about the Duggars, and I was like, how I couldn't imagine what the wife, I honestly don't know her name. I never watched the show because I lived that life, so it's like I didn't care to watch it. But the wife of Josh Duggar, like I said, I cannot imagine going to bed with someone knowing that they did things like that, and being silent and so submissive to it. And you know, so I was talking to my guardians, and you know, I've always tried to be the person that tries to see both sides and understand people. But when it comes to pedophilia, it's so hard, I think, especially to try to understand that person. It's like, it's such an awful thing, child abuse and child molestation, and the things that are done to children and filmed and put, it's so hard to empathize and understand someone who does things like that, because it makes you see the worst in humanity, and you just don't want to confront that. I guess you would call it, like, I guess the shadow part of humanity or whatever, that's something we don't want to confront. And you know, and my guardians are like, Andrew, they're like, we're not defending pedophilia at all, not at all, we're not, but it's so important that we understand what caused this person to do this, because we had to get to the root of the issue. We can't just be like, oh my gosh, like, you're a horrible person, let's put you in jail. What caused this? Otherwise this issue is going to keep happening. And it's a systemic problem. And you know, the sad thing is, like, kids who are, not all the time, but kids who are sexually abused, they can grow up to become abusers. And because they, number one, they never had an adult to help them work through that. And it really does mess up you, like emotionally, psychologically, mentally. And I'm sure like sexual assault greatly hurts all your relationships and your view of people in general, like trauma in general
Yeah.
changes your entire perspective, no matter what kind of trauma it is. Like I know after learning about trauma and religious trauma, I realized how distorted it made everything. And so what I see in like Christianity, and as I've dug into deconstructing and truly figuring out, I'm like, what do I hate so much about this religion? Why does this bug me so much? Because like I wasn't the kind of person to be like, oh God, I hate this. I'm just gonna leave it and not think about it again. It's like, no, I want to figure out what are the issues. And as I was talking with someone who's a friend who claims to be a Christian, and I was like, I told them like, I have a lot of issues with Christianity, but what I see is just this going and pointing out and saying, oh, this is sin, this is sin, this is sin. And I'm like, that's so unintelligent. Like we have to go deeper. Like if someone comes out in the church, like, oh my gosh, like a sex abuse or a child abuse, you're like, oh my gosh, it's so sad, that's sin. And we don't dig any deeper to the causes around that and the dynamics and the complexity of the issue and the situation, we're not going to solve these issues. It's so easy to think in black and white terms and these simplistic ways of like, oh my gosh, sin, 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 just pray, ask Jesus to your heart and he'll cleanse you. And then like, to me, it's like, it's a bunch of magical thinking, really. That's what I've learned in therapy. And it's something I still struggle with some things in life, because as I talked to my therapist, I was like, not gonna lie, I'm like, I've kind of been disappointed in the progress I've made in therapy. And I told my therapist, I'm like, I just expected to tell you everything that's happened in my life and what's wrong with me. And then you just tell me what to do to fix it.
Yeah.
Like, no, he's like, it's not that simple. He's like, that's magical thinking, Andrew.
Yeah. But that's how we grew up a lot of the time, right? We had an issue, you go to the pastor, youth pastor, whatever, your parents, and they pray with you. Maybe you talk about it a bit and you go, oh, why don't you confess? Why don't you ask God for help? Why don't you read your Bible and think about it? But generally speaking, it was a kind of like before, after, nice, clean cut. And like we all know, we've all had different things that we tried to get changed or break through in some way, shape, or form. It just didn't happen. It isn't that simple. And
it's not.
And a lot of religion is based in these very early developments psychologically, very much black and white. Like if you do bad, you get punished. If you do good, you get rewarded. And even you listen to people and they're like, oh, well, I don't understand how atheists will do good because there's no heaven and no hell. Like, why would they do good if they're going to not get heaven? And why wouldn't they just go around and sleep with everyone they want or rape and kill because there's no punishment? And I'm like, wait, are you saying the only reason you don't rape and kill people is because there's no punishment? Because that's fucking terrifying. But on some level, I think some people, I don't know if many people actually live like that genuinely, but I think on some level that's how they process it. They genuinely look at the other people, especially in the world out there, and they go, oh, the only reason they don't do that is because of some Christian values. They fear hell, and I'm like, no, actually kind of the opposite. They have much higher morals, and they are looking at like, why do I not harm someone else sexually? Oh, it's because they're an autonomous person. Maybe I wouldn't like to be harmed. Maybe I wouldn't be like to be taken advantage of. Oh, maybe that's just not right. Maybe that's harmful. Maybe that's not healthy. Asking these deep questions. And I do think when it comes to Christianity, sexual abuse, especially that of minors, Christianity is built on ethics of sexual abuse. Because it's built on ethics of sex that are thousands of years old. Right? It's built on women are property. It's built on children are property. It's built on children are sexual objects to be bought when they first come on their periods, right? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. If we look at purity culture, this new phenomenon that's arisen in the last kind of few decades, because it is a new phenomenon. It's a weird kind of bizarre uprising, but like that's not always been what we had as a framework. it's quite pedophilic. If you actually look at the roots of purity culture, it's grooming, it's trying to teach children to stay innocent, to not talk about sex, to not talk about their bodies, to not look at their bodies.
Yes.
It's teaching children, hey, all these grown-up men are going to be like looking at you and lusting after you, so make sure you cover up. Like, it's like, really? Because can we talk about the fact that our church is full of men that are lusting after a 13-year-old girl because she's wearing a strapless top? Can we talk about that? Not, let's tell the 13-year-old girl that she's a sexual object. Like,
and that's the issue. They're not getting to the root of the issue at all.
No. And if anything, we're creating a larger issue. And I think
definitely
there is, you mentioned, America being the largest consumer of child porn, and I'm sure there's many factors involved there. But I know Pornhub have put out some really good data on this. And obviously they don't have child porn, or at least if they do, they're trying to keep on top of it. They're trying to be a squeaky clean company as best you can. But they've put out data on like which states consume what kind of porn the most and things like that. And what's really fascinating is it's the most conservative states in America that consume the most taboo stuff. And so if you look at incest porn, now, from my understanding, I don't think it's actually incest. I think it's like, role play stuff.
Role play,
but that's most consumed in the South. If you look at, role play, like sexual abuse, like forced rape, violent porn, things like that, again, most consumed in the South. Now it's consumed elsewhere, of course, but it's these hyper-religious places, these religious states that are consuming the most taboo. And they were talking about there's a type of porn where they basically find adult women that look like kids. And so I don't know how that plays out. I guess petite, and they're probably dressed in certain ways. But again, this kind of fake pedophilic child porn, but it's adult porn, but it's pretending. It's so fucked up, right? But again, most consumed in the religious South. And so you look at these components and you go, there's something here about we say one thing, we do the very opposite. And maybe it's not that we're doing the opposite, actually, because when you actually look at some of the theology, you go, oh, maybe this is in our theology, right? I mean, on some level, there is a whole bunch of incest in the Bible that we kind of just that's what it's like. And God's ways are higher than our ways. I don't know. I'm assuming no one's going, I'm going to model that in my porn. But it's there. And there is lots of sex with minors. There's lots of possession of minors. There's a lot of violence in sex in the Bible. And there's weird dynamics there for sure. But I do think, we look at that and it's like, I don't think it's a surprise that the religious portions of America are the most taboo in their outlook.
Yes. And like, I love psychology.
Oh, and gay porn as well, by the way, most consumed in the South. Big time, big time. Yeah, and not to mention, more queer types of porn. So things like with transgender and things like that. Again, most consumed in the South. And so you got all these people that are literally like screaming, like, transgenders are ruining America, and then they're getting onto Pornhub and being like, transgender man has sex with transgender women, or I don't know, like they're figuring out the most bizarre thing, and I'm like, what is that? And is that a power? Is that a hatred of the object that there's all sorts of different dynamics there.
But the psychological thing of like projecting your hatred of something. I mean, projecting is really where there's something you don't want to deal with inside of yourself, so you project it or put it onto other people, and it's an unconscious thing. And I think the issue really is like I said, I love psychology. It's something I'm getting into, and I plan to get my master's in psychology. And nice. I've had all these questions that I write down in a notebook, and I'm like, okay, and I basically I read like 2 books a week because I try to answer these big questions in my life. Because I feel like right now, like growing up, knowledge was withheld and controlled a lot for me. I could only read like Christian literature, and if it was not Christian, it was just stuff like, Magic Treehouse, Boxcar Children, Hardy Boys, like nothing like regarding to like worldview, philosophy, or religion. It was just these, and I did read a lot, but it's like, I want to learn other things. I want to expand my mind, but my parents were so afraid of that that I wanted to read And like, to me, that was just a red flag. I'm like, okay, if you say your religion is 100% true and accurate and that it's infallible, then you should have an issue with me reading other things. So um, I discovered in the last several months the issues and really what my issue with Christianity was, but I didn't realize it. It was just so deep inside of my psyche. And then once I actually read about it, and I love Carl Jung so much. I wish he was still alive today, but yeah, he died in the early. But if I could resurrect anyone, like forget Jesus, I would resurrect Carl Jung. Like,
I love it so much.
And so he was a big, like, truth seeker and questioner. Like, he did not accept the answers that religion gave us. Like, he really did deconstruct. He wasn't satisfied with the answer religion was getting, and he was like, I'm going to dig deeper and understand, like, using everything like a comprehensive way of figuring all of this out. And like, the thing that he discovered, the issue with the world at the core of it psychologically, is that we repress this part of ourselves called the shadow. And his issue with Christianity, he's like, they embrace the light and deny the darkness, deny the flesh. He's like, what they're doing is that's causing an imbalance in their psyche. Yeah. And he says, whatever is repressed will build up psychic energy, and it will eventually be so big that it will overpower your consciousness and things. So for people who don't know what the shadow is, you know, for me, I've had to try to get this like negative connotation with the word shadow or shadow parts of yourself, and getting rid of that, oh, I'm brought into the core belief.
Yeah.
And like realizing that two things can be true at the same time. Like, yes, I can have good qualities about myself and I don't have bad qualities. But just because I have bad qualities, does that mean that all of me is rotten to the core? No. There are things I need to work on, but there are still good parts of me. And that was so hard for me to get to that point, to know, well, you know what, I have good and bad inside of me. And I'm aware of that. And because I'm aware of that, I can control that. And so the shadow is basically, it's a mix of things that are good and bad, which seems kind of contradictory that it's called a shadow. But shadow, basically, we hide things. Things are hidden in the shadows, basically, if you can think of it that way. So a shadow can be different in every culture and different for every person. And really what influences your shadow is your social group, the family you're in, the church you're in, community, the country you're in. So for example, men are very discouraged from being emotional. So emotions can be a part of men's shadow, things something they ignore, don't deal with, that they have a negative view of. And even though emotions aren't bad, and so men are repressing their emotions, and because of that, men have such a higher rate of depression. Like the depression rates for men are terrible, and like there's that correlation between repressing emotions and not dealing with them, because that's just a feminine thing.
Yeah.
And the thing that blew my mind was finding out that our personalities we have masculine and feminine traits in our personalities.
Yeah.
And our conservative traditional culture has told us, no, you can only be masculine, and the women, you can only be feminine, even though we have two parts of this in our psyche. Our personalities are made up. So we're oppressing these parts of ourselves that eventually will explode. So like, for example, like the women's rights movement, there was the more masculine traits inside of them that's like, you know what, I don't really want to be submissive. I want a career of my own. I don't want to be a servant. And so they were like, but the thing is, there was pushback from the men from that. So they were repressing that more masculine part of their personality. And it blows. I'm like, I wish psychology and mental health could be taught, because I feel like a lot of issues we have in the world today are because of the shadow part of humanity. Yeah. We're just hiding these things, repressing these things, a part of ourselves. And we're like, the truth is, people don't understand the psyche, that if you repress something, it's not going to go away. It's not going to disappear into thin air. It is going to stay in your mind somewhere in the deep, dark depths of your unconscious, and it will sometimes pop out every once in a while when the energy becomes too great. And so really, because, you know, growing up as I got older, I'm like, I don't think the gospel is the answer for the world's problems.
Hmm.
Like, I've grown up all around people who claim to have their lives changed by the gospel. And I look at them and I'm like, y'all are the most unaware people on this planet of who you are and what you're capable of. Like,
Yeah.
you're the most emotionally immature human beings on this planet. And like, I'm paraphrasing this quote, but there's a quote by Carl Jung that's basically like, whatever you're unconscious of or unaware of will always control you, and you'll call it fate. So it's not helping anyone out that we're avoiding ourselves. And Carl Jung's like, he understood too how hard it is to balance the light and dark in our personalities. But he's like, if there's an imbalance, if you embrace the light, then that's going to cause imbalance. If you embrace evil and darkness, that's going to cause an imbalance. He's like, he's like, Carl Jung argued, he's like, without, like, if there's no evil, there's no good. Like, it's a duality. You know what I mean? Like, they define each other. So it's like, so then I was like, I'm like, it makes no sense that God is all good. There's no bad in the world, because there had to be something bad to compare. And Carl Jung argues in his book, Answer to Job, which I love so much. It's one of his most controversial books, and it blew my mind. And he's like, God is good and God is evil. And I was like, mind blow, what?
Yeah. Which is very like traditional. Like a lot of early religions saw God as all encompassing. Early monotheism, so early Judaism, God was God, but he was also Satan. Those were the two sides of God.
Yes.
It wasn't until later that this monotheist, that this one God, because there used to be lots of gods, and you could go, some are good, some are bad, but they're all kind of equally in charge. So fuck knows what's going to happen today. And then they're like, no, there's maybe only one God, but he kind of bit good, bit bad. Who knows? And then over time, we decided, no, this God is only good. And then we had to create a Satan, right? We have to, well, there's got to be a bad guy then, because otherwise, how? And then you're going, well, yeah, but is God all powerful? There's a bad guy that gets his way so much. Like, it's just this complex, weird dynamic where we're breaking these things up constantly.
And
but it's not a revolutionary thought in a sense. Like, people for thousands of years have been wrestling with this. And the concept that divinity might not be all good. It's made sense to a lot of people for a very long time.
It makes sense, but it's like when you're indoctrinated in this environment, it's like God is all good and all loving. And like the terrible thing is when there are these awful things, the Old Testament of what God in quotations did. There were things in scripture when I was a Christian that I just overlooked because it bothered me too much. And I didn't want to deal with that. So I was deconstructing. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to face the scriptures that none of these other little willy-nilly Christians aren't really getting into. And I'm going to like, to me, it's like, okay, I'm like, I want to know what I'm truly leaving before I actually leave it. And so once I read like controversial things, the Old Testament, about like there were moments of God, like he had them destroy cities, and he's like, take the virgins for yourselves, do whatever you want. And like basically he's telling them to rape them. And I was like, oh, okay, like this is uncomfortable. This is not sound like a loving God at all. And as I deconstructed, I'm like, I began to see how people use religion to justify violence and to say, oh, well, God told us to do these things. Like, I personally, at this point in my life, I would call myself agnostic. Like, I believe in some kind of like higher source, I guess you would say. I don't know if it's personal or not, like the Christians like to say, but I do not believe there is a such thing as religion that is like true, if that makes sense, like literally true. At least I don't believe there's a religion that has it right, if there's an afterlife or not. Like when I die, I don't know what's going to happen. If someone asks me that, I have no idea. Like this stupid question, like, are you going to go to heaven or hell? It's like, I don't know if either exists. Like, I don't really like neither. Like, and that's been the hardest thing for me, is to stop believing in hell, because that was used as a fear and control tactic to keep people in the fold. And once you got saved, to keep you in, they would like make you doubt your salvation too. The validity, you're actually to keep you, oh no, like like, of course he would say, oh, if you have issues or you don't like going to church, maybe you're not saved. He's like, if you're saved, you'll love going to church. You'll be happy tithing. It's like, this is manipulation. You're making us
Right.
stay and do money. You're like, oh God, so
Yeah.
stupid.
It
And it's
works though, right? I mean, when you're in that space and you just kind of accept that these people in power know what they're talking about,
uh,
you just start to go, maybe there's something wrong with me that I'm not excited about giving 10% of my salary to this person that's
yeah,
already very wealthy. Like,
yeah,
oh, mate, yeah, the problem is probably me. Why would I resent that? Like, why would I be like that
uh,
towards God who's given me everything? Or, right? It's like,
uh,
it works. Like, it
yeah, it
makes
does.
sense until it doesn't, right?
Mhm.
Um,
And
yeah.
like, it's funny because when I tell people about my experiences in Christianity, more specifically Christians say this, they're like, oh, that's not real Christianity.
They
And I'm like,
love to say that, right?
I was like, okay, so there are 45,000 Christian denominations across the world. Tell me which ones are right. Like,
Yeah.
who are
You make a
you?
list.
Who are you? Like, how do you have the authority to tell me what is or is not Christianity
Right.
based on your personal
Oh,
beliefs?
excuse me.
And the thing that I hate is that whenever there's like any negative scandal, they're like, oh my gosh, no, that's not Christianity. Like they try to disassociate, like they're not a
Yes.
part of it. And it's like they have the exact beliefs as you and they practice
Yeah.
things the way they do. So it's like, sorry, sweetie, like hate to break it to you, like they're Christians. And
Yeah.
it's just the issue with that is if we keep projecting onto other people, these churches, they're never going to deal with these core issues. And, for me, like hell was the hardest thing for me to stop believing in, which right now, like, I don't believe in hell at all, which is incredible for me to say, or even heaven, as it's portrayed in the Bible of like this
Mm.
hell is this like torture chamber for eternity. It's just it took me so long because but to see the thing is knowledge is power,
Yeah.
really. Once you find out about how the concept of hell has changed so much throughout history, it's like, well, this is not infallible at all. This is
Right.
not changing. Like, this is something man created. It's like, wait, like it blew my mind when I realized that hell was never in the Old Testament. Like in the
Yeah.
Old Testament, it talked about that you were in the Sheol or the grave, you're put in dirt. And like there was no concept of hell. And I think really, as I see the Old Testament and the New Testament, it just shows the evolution of thinking of
Yeah.
mankind. And if we're talking about the reward and punishment, I think the Israelites and the Jews had an issue of like, oh, I want these people to suffer. Like they shouldn't just die nothing. So let's somehow. I honestly, I hell. The interesting thing is, as I've learned, religion is really all religions are mythology.
Yeah.
Um, I've been reading Joseph Campbell
Nice.
lately, and right now I'm reading Myths to Live By. Like I've had a bunch of his books for a while, several months, but like I haven't dug into them yet because I was intimidated by. It. I'm like, this is really deep shit. Like I don't know if I'm ready for this. But like I've been reading a lot of Carl Jung, and I'm like, you know what? I'm loving Jung. I'm like, let's dig into Campbell.
If you can read
And
Young, you can definitely dive into
yeah,
Campbell, right?
yeah. And so it really has like lifted that burden off me of realizing that the thing in which it's so complex mythology and psychology. And these Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell have done a great job. Like they are both geniuses.
Yeah.
It's incredible how they took these concepts and basically mythology, which I'm just been learning, digging into this a lot this week. So I'm trying to say it in the best way. Mythology is are stories that are figurative expressions of things going on in our psyche, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And Carl Jung had this theory called the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious is basically all of mankind in this collective unconscious, this area of his mind or brain, has these exactly the same ideas, symbols, and motifs, basically. Because as we look through mythology, through history, there are these cultures that would have had no interaction with each other, and their stories are the same at the foundational level,
Right.
like the hero myth, the savior of sacrificing himself and dying and saving people. That's the hero myth. Like the story of Jesus Christ is not original
Right.
at all.
Far from.
It's far from original. And the differences in these stories are the specifics, but at the foundation, they're all the same blueprint and dynamics of it. And so Carl Jung is like, there's no way that these people could have like stolen this from someone else. Like these cultures had these similar ideas. And what Carl Jung and Campbell figured out was that, and this really blew my mind too, was that these stories were representing forces in our psyche. And when I started digging more into Sigmund Freud and I heard about the ego, the super ego, and the id, I'm like, okay, the id is this thing that is all about passion and it's instinctual, and it just, basically it's like the equivalent of like the flesh. It just lusts and wants and wants and wants.
Right.
And like, I think the ego is like the more rational part of you. And I think the super ego, the super ego is more rational. The ego balances out the id and the super ego. And so as I read this, I'm like, this sounds like some stories in the Bible of like God and Satan and mankind fighting and like with each other. And once I started seeing the correlation of, oh my gosh, like these stories are reflections of things that we are struggling with in our own minds. These things did not literally happen. This was meant to be taken metaphorically. Oh my God, what? Like it's blown my mind. And I'm like,
so funny.
And it's just, and I talked to my guardians about that. They're like, the Bible was never supposed to be taken literally. And like, it's metaphor. And what happened was people wanted certainty. So they changed mythology. They transformed it into literal, even though it was never supposed to be that way. And so it's so confusing because we're not actually learning the lessons that it's really meant to us. Right. And so I was reading about Adam and Eve, the creation myth. So I was like, okay, well, what is the meaning of this if it's not literal? Because evangelicals and fundamentalists hate the idea that the creation story is a myth, because if it's a myth, then their entire story doesn't matter about Christ dying on the cross at all. Like, it doesn't matter. And so,
which is so funny, right? Because the early church didn't engage with the Genesis story as literal. So like clearly, but Jesus still had a massive meaning to them. So they have so far removed what Jesus means that they have to so far remove what the Genesis story means. Right? You know what I mean? It's like they're just we're constantly evolving further and further away from what probably these original stories really meant to people and helped us.
And so as I talked to my guardians, like Andrew, like we're supposed to learn from these myths and things, these stories going on. And growing up, it is so crazy to me that adults actually looked me in the eye and told me that God created the world in 7 days and that the world is between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. Like even in college, I was told that by professors. And I'm like, y'all are full of so much shit. Like, this is not, like, y'all are deluding yourselves. Like, this is so ridiculous. And
it's so crazy. I just can't get my head around the fact that American colleges can teach that, and you can walk away with a degree and people think you've been educated in reality, but you've been told, like, I mean, it's just terrifying. Absolutely terrifying.
And the interesting thing is these private Christian universities, Bob Jones is regionally accredited. So they do have a very good high standard education. But the issue is, in order to get that accreditation, they have to teach evolution. And they do have to. But they also teach creationism in conjunction to that. So basically, their way of evolution is like, this is what scientists are saying. This is all wrong. Creationism.
Right. Look how stupid it is.
Yeah. And, to me, it's like, you know what? I don't think that the theory of evolution is 100% accurate. It's a theory. But to go to the extreme and say it's 100% wrong is like, come on. We do have evidence of evolution. yes, they might not get all the specifics 100% right, but there are general things in evolution that we can see through the fossils that we found in the aging of things. And it's like, oh no, but God created the earth really, really old. It's like, okay, whatever. He just happened to bury bones here.
God's just like this ultimate troll. Like, this will fuck him up. Put a Stegosaurus in there. You sure, God? That seems a bit trolly. Nope. Yeah, put a T-Rex and a Stegosaurus in there, but split 60 million years. Yeah, that'll get him.
Like, I remember at 13 years old visiting the Grand Canyon with my family on vacation, and I remember my parents saying, "Wow," they're like, "This is so incredible that the worldwide flood and Noah's Ark did this." And I was like, okay, and I did believe that at that time at 13 years old. Like, I had no access to internet or any resources outside of Christianity, so of course
it's amazing a worldwide flood that was over the entire earth only did that in one location.
I know, right? One location.
Profound. Amazing. It's really funny.
Oh God. So I'm sure I digress a little bit, but
that's good. This podcast is all about the digressions.
Yeah, we love the digression, the rabbit holes. But no, like these Christian universities, it blows my mind that they're teaching this. And back to the story of creation, it was Joseph Campbell. What the funny thing is, I'm reading Campbell and Young on mythology, so I'm probably confusing which said what.
Mixing them up.
Mixing them up. But one of them was talking about in their work that they were figuring out what it meant with the fruit and the tree. And Young said his interpretation is like, it represents how our evolution somehow in our brain, like we did not have like that rational part of our brains at one point. We did not have the ability to think philosophically and to just, or we did not, what's it called? Like metacognition or something, like being aware of awareness, basically. Yes, it's kind of like confusing.
Consciousness, really.
Consciousness, really. Yeah. And so he was saying that how, yes, consciousness has made us evolve and progress, but because we evolved with this consciousness, we had the knowledge of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, really, I hate the phrase ignorance is bliss, but really before we had that consciousness, we were ignorant, lesser form animals.
Yeah.
And so we did not have consciousness. So we lived literally, when we really did in our own minds, we lived in a perfect world because we were unaware.
Yeah.
We couldn't think about death. We did not have the concept of what's going to happen when I die, or, oh, what's the purpose of my life? I have to have some much deeper meaning in this. We had much simpler brains. So somewhere along the way, we evolved and we had that consciousness. It was like picking that fruit from the knowledge of good and evil. We had that knowledge of good and evil, and we realized all these things about ourselves and the world, and it completely changed everything figuratively, really. Things were always really, I guess, I mean, the interesting thing is we cannot prove reality outside of our human consciousness.
Right. No, absolutely.
You cannot. Like, you cannot go out of your consciousness and prove reality is real. You know what I mean? That's the frustrating thing. And so people are like, no, reality is real. All right, prove it outside of yourself.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just so mind-blowing. And, there's all kinds of philosophers who are like, it's kind of like the Matrix type thing. The Matrix kind of took some philosophy and turned it into an incredible franchise of like how, what if we're being controlled by some other force and our reality is not really what we think it is, it's just our perception, and that maybe there's something deeper going on. And so, yeah, at the core of it, this story, the creation myth of what the hardships that came with consciousness and a higher evolved brain. And that just blew my mind. And I was like, oh my God, because like I never believed evolution for a long time. But I didn't understand evolution. I hate the word believe when it comes to evolution because it's just not accurate. I didn't understand evolution.
Right.
And so once I actually I've researched some. I haven't dug into it a lot yet because I think it'll be a lot. Like I have a lot to catch up on. But my guardians lent me a book called The Inner Fish. So that's something I'm probably
Mm.
going to start soon. It's a famous book about evolution. But as I've dug into certain things, I'm like, okay, so we didn't always have this brain. Like in psychology, I learned about we had the reptilian brain, and then we had the mammalian brain, and then we have the neocortex. The neocortex is the most recent evolution of our brain. And so I was like, and I'm like, okay, and they've actually like proved this. Like they've seen this in other animals.
Hmm.
And then ours is the next stage. And I'm like, oh my God, like this makes so much sense that basically somehow the unconscious is such an incredible concept. And it's something that all of mankind has really underestimated. And that was Young. Young was like, this is the issue with all these religions and even science. Like we are underestimating the power of our unconsciousness. And when I was reading more about mythology, that like Jesus was like an archetype for the self. And like that just blew my mind too. Because like I was so wicked and awful. I'm like, and he talked like I think I read some about like the mandala, the symbol. Basically is like a circle that's symmetrical with all these patterns in it, basically, and how it was a representative of God or the self. And I'm like, and like I'm not saying necessarily that not in the Christian version of God, not that like, oh, like we are God. I do believe that there is some kind of like higher source of energy or power stored in our brains. That's just all I'll call it. I won't
Mm.
like I guess you would say the divine within, and not like the divine like in Christianity, I would necessarily call it. And like the thing is, I don't think we don't really understand divinity yet. I don't think personally with other religions we have. I think it's something like we haven't figured it out yet. And I think that's what I love Young about. He's like, we haven't figured this out. Religion's not giving us the answer of really where we came from or what
Mm.
is inside of us and what we're capable of. And he saw that the Bible was just transformed mythology of really, as human beings, we are trying to balance our personalities and these forces in our psyche to create our own heaven. To me, I
Mm.
see heaven and hell as internal states. I don't believe them as literal places. There
Right.
exists in your mind. And as you evolve, like really, we're all on that journey of trying to make heaven in our minds and to balance out our psyche and bridging together our unconscious and our consciousness, basically. And like that's really blown my mind. I'm like, oh my God, like that makes so much sense. And like Young would like show all these examples of people who were out of touch and unaware. And it's really incredible because he had like a premonition of like World War II, I think, or something like that. And like, so he knew that there was something in his psyche that was connected to something greater. And to me, I think, and I know it's cheesy of what you hear in like new age stuff of like how we're all connected, we're all one consciousness, you know what I mean? But I think somehow on a level we are connected. And it's, even our bodies have like um, electromagnetic waves, even from our heart, that we know, and like we can't see that, but we know it's there from the technology that we have that can detect that. But what if there's something else that we don't know about our minds that can connect? Because like what Young noticed was there's this thing called synchronosity, and it was where these things just worked out so perfectly that it's like something had to work this out. Like this is crazy.
Mm.
So like for example, let's say you're thinking of a friend and they call you a second later. Like it's so because that's happened to me several times. It's like,
Right.
okay, it's like, are we somehow connected on some wavelength because we're good friends? We made that like soul or spirit connection. And I was so scared to think of life that way because I'm like, at first I was like, no, there's no such thing as spiritual realm, or there's nothing. To me, it's like once I realized I'm like, there's so much that our senses can only sense. Like our eyes can only see so much of light.
Yeah.
And our ears can only hear so many frequencies. So it's like, that's the frustrating thing too, is that you cannot like prove or disprove a spiritual reality, I guess you would say. And I think to me, it's so frustrating because then that causes Christians to push their agenda more like, well, you can't prove or disprove it, so we're going to just believe it and we're going to push this on. So it's like, fuck, okay, whatever.
It does feel like it's with spirituality, it's kind of a catch-all for everything we don't understand.
Yeah, really.
And so like it's the thing of like, okay, I just thought of my friend Bob and he called me. Not the creepy Bob I mentioned earlier. But I'll call back for you. But just thought of Bob, he called me, and you would get a whole bunch of people going, yeah, but you think about Bob a lot and he doesn't call you. So maybe just sometimes while you're thinking of Bob, he calls you. Like you just noticed the 1 in 10,000 times you thought of Bob when he called you. And maybe he calls you 1 in 10,000 times. Like that's common. But then you have other people going, well, actually, yeah, maybe there is something. I you know, like you think of a song and it plays on the radio. You turn on the radio and you're like, Jesus, that's the song. But then you go, well, maybe somehow I'm picking up all the radio waves bouncing around the US right now. And on some level, I tuned into that song and I thought, let's listen to the radio and turn it on. And it's on. I don't know, but we can't see that. But maybe there's a very physical, you know, we create the right thing and we go, oh, the human brain picks up radio waves.
And like the interesting thing is like, is that God has been compared with the unconscious because the unconscious is like unknowable. Right. And to me, that in my mind, it's like, we really don't know what we're capable of, really. Right. And like the part that we do know how incredible our minds are is the collective unconscious and all these mythologies that have come across the world. And it's like, let's understand this. And like to Jung, he's like, this story, he's like, mythology is not over. Like we're still transforming as these forces are coming in our mind. And he's like, if we are not going to take these religions metaphorically and understand the mythology behind them, he's like, we will not progress spiritually or even emotionally, more specifically psychologically as a human race. He's like, we're going to be unaware of what's going on in our psyche. And really, I understood the core of it that I hated. Another thing I hate about Christianity was that how it disconnects you from yourself a lot. It teaches you that you're evil, you cannot trust yourself, your heart is deceitful, like the devil can plant thoughts in your mind. So you're taught to think that you're everything bad about you inside and out. So it's like you won't to even think that there is like an infinite depth to your mind somewhere, or power, or a part of your mind is like comparable to a deity or something. It's just not even in the mind of a fundamentalist because they're so unaware and uneducated really on a lot of things, especially like just science in general and psychology. And so once I thought about that, I'm like, okay, I'm like, they're just using this religion to deal with life and to get it through. And like, really, religion, like it meets a lot of human needs, at least, or answers.
It really does.
It gives people certainty, and like people have that need for certainty. And like the funny thing is, I've learned too recently that people also have a need for uncertainty. Like we need that balance of certainty and uncertainty, because if you're certain about everything in life, like what a boring life that is. Like, oh, you have it all figured out, Joe, over there. Oh, good for you. All right, just wait to die, I guess. Like, and that's what I never understood about fundamentalist Christianity. Like I was so unsatisfied with it. I'm like, I don't believe the gospel is the answer to the word. I'm like, once I got older and in college and I would sit through in chapel and hear the same messages I heard growing up, I'm like, this shit is not it. Like, this is not it. Like, and as I could think more critically, I was like, okay, so God created the world. He was all knowing. He knew that Adam and Eve would fuck up. And then he curses all of mankind for something that two people did. He knew he was going to create a hell, heaven, knew he was going to torture people, but he didn't want us to go to hell, but he still created it and knew we were going to throw us into it anyways. And so just all these different things. And it's like, and even I argued with my dad. I was like, you tell me that your God is just, but I told him, like, you take the creation myth literally. I told him, I don't. I think it's metaphor. And it clearly is, but I'm like, you take it literally. I'm like, it makes no sense that a just God would curse all of humanity for what like a man and a woman
Right.
did in the beginning. I'm like, that's not just like, I'm like, the very premise of it is just faulty.
Yeah.
So I'm like, no, I was like, that's like, I don't buy into it. And like all this self-hatred, self-loathing, and just basically, and like, what blew my mind, even like in college, was that I'll just tell people like, I've made a proclamation of faith like 5 times throughout my life. That just tells you how unsure I
Right.
was about my salvation. And like, how do you really know that you're saved? Like, tried to make it so clear and clean cut. And like I said, like if you were doing these lists of things, like, oh, you're saved. And I think it was like my junior year of college, I had one more, like, it was my last proclamation of faith. And it was at a time when I was very emotionally vulnerable. I've been struggling with a depressive episode for like 7 months already. So of course I was vulnerable. And like a lot of the sermons in fundamentalist environments, and even at Bob Jones, they're very hateful, condescending, and shame-based. And like every once in a while, they'll throw in a really loving, like awesome sermon that just gets up your emotions. That just, oh, like God loves me so much. And like, I just felt like, oh my gosh, this is what I need. And like, really, after the experience, I'm like, that was an emotional and psychological experience. And that's really why it was my last one. I was like, this is not spiritual at all. I'm like, this is emotional
Right.
manipulation. And I'm like, once I realized, I'm like, this is not helping me deal with things that are going on. And like this term, which I learned recently, is called spiritual bypassing. And it's where you use spirituality to not deal with deeper core psychological issues. It's just slapping a Bible verse at it. Like, oh, it's just mental health. Oh, just read this. You're not close to God. That's why your mental health is bad. Like, and like you don't even consider if that person's been through trauma, sexual abuse. You don't even consider their attachment style, their relationship with their parents, or anything in their past, or even their genetic. It is like, or history of mental health either. It's like, oh, it's like this bypassing, avoiding things that are deeper. And that's really right before I left it. That's what I really saw. I'm like, these are really, really sad people who they could not even deal with reality. It is too much for them. So they have to have this to give them all this comfort of an afterlife, and that, oh, someone is looking out for them now. And as I learned in psychology, how Christianity really plays on psychological needs, like hell. I mean, it's not just a place of torment in the Bible, it's a place of abandonment. And being abandoned is a really common fear for a lot of people. A lot of people have been abandoned physically, emotionally. And the thought that, oh, if I live forever, oh, I'm abandoned forever. Like they know what it's like. Like forgetting the torture part, forget that they scare you with. Just imagine like the abandonment, the aloneness. And so they really prey on those needs. And like the truth is, we all have an inner child, really. And so there is that child too. Even when you're an adult, there's that child that wants an authority figure or a father figure or something to rely on. And so, of course, Christianity is like the perfect solution. That, oh my gosh, God the Father, like here you go. Come to our church, pray, like you can be good with God, give to our church, just do all these things, do all these rituals to give you emotional and psychological satisfaction. And so the thing is, I definitely do believe there are benefits to religion in general. And there are definitely like negatives to, I mean, it's how you approach it, really. And to me,
and
like,
who approaches it as well, I think, is a big factor. Some people are in a place where they need that, right? Like you mentioned. And I think even culturally, you go back 2,000 years, people needed a lot more stability, right? They didn't have stable cultures. They didn't have your city could belong to a completely different state, nation next week. Or even like crime, like police, whether you're a very big fan of police or not, but there wasn't much law and order in the past. And, you know, you could go somewhere and kill a bunch of people and probably get away with it in certain contexts, you know, like that's a terrifying place to live. And actually, I need to believe that if we all do the right thing, we're all going to be okay. And if you do things that are bad, there's going to be serious consequences. Even if there's no police to arrest you and jail to go to, which to some degree there is these kind of things, you would burn forever. You'd be abandoned forever. Oh, that makes me feel
better,
more safe knowing that people wouldn't do that. Surely they wouldn't choose to go to hell. Or even also, it makes me feel safe knowing that that person that abused me, who will never get what he deserves, will get what he deserves. And so I say this as well, like a lot of time, like people talk about hell as trauma, and it can be. But for a lot of people, hell isn't trauma. And in fact, for a lot of people, hell is the answer to their trauma. Because it gives them the peace knowing that that person that wronged me, that person that killed someone, that person that abused someone, Hitler, whatever it is, these people that don't seem to get what they deserve in this life will get what they deserve later. And so I think like these things, they're complex, right? Because that could really harm someone, and yet it really helped the next person. And you're like, what the fuck is that? It's complex.
Yeah, it is complex thing. And like trauma is honestly, it is subjective.
Yeah.
And we all have different minds. And the interesting thing is, you know, I talk about the collective unconscious. Of course, we have our own personal consciousness, if that makes sense. And, you know, collective unconscious, that theory, that brain that's universal. But, you know, we all grow up in different families who have different opinions, who raise us in different ways. And like I said, our personalities and then our dynamics of our families all influence these things and how we perceive the world. And really, what I've learned is that trauma is not the event itself, but it is your body's and mind's reaction to the event. And, you know, for me, it was hard for me to read about that. And it kind of, at first, it made me like blame myself, like, oh no, I didn't react the right way, I didn't do this or this. But once I learned more about it, I learned that it was actually instinctual. It was nothing that I had control over, which was also the thing I had to like wrap my brain around, because I was always taught that I have a free will, that I'm you know, I can always make choices, and that if I do wrong, it's my fault. But I'm like, no, it's like there's a part of our minds that's instinctual, that causes us to do things that may not necessarily like it. Technically, it does protect us. These instincts that protect us. You know, like I'm still alive today because of all of the survival instincts that kicked in during my time in fundamentalist Christianity. Like I struggle today with disassociation, and it really stops me from living my life, but it protected me then. And really what I learned is that, you know, my body and my nervous system was always in such a state of like dysregulation. And there was so much that my mind couldn't deal with, all these messages being thrown at me at church. And so my mind's like, all right, we are checking out. We are leaving your body, your presence. So like I lived, even at college, I lived in a state of like constant disassociation. And like when I talk about my past with my therapist, I'm like, it all feels like a bad dream because I was rarely present. Like my mind and my body, like I was somewhere else. And the issue is that now that I've left that environment, I'm learning to really get in touch with my body and be aware of my body and things that are going on, and be present, because that danger is gone. But like my mind is still so used to that. And so that's the incredible thing that I've learned about, is that in order to be present, you have to be aware and in touch with your body. And, you know, it really, like, fundamentalist Christianity and Christianity can really fuck up, and has fucked up a lot of people psychologically. Just really did this self-annihilation, this disconnection from yourself, that really, it creates people, it makes them helpless, and it makes them so dependent on this system. And yes, there are emotional rewards that they get, but in the long run, like, it messes you up so much. And it just saddens me to see these adults that still go to these churches, and I'm like, and they can't see how much it has stopped them from progressing as human beings, just from enjoying life. And, you know, and of course, you know, my parents still hold their beliefs, and like they see me as like I'm blind to the truth,
Right.
that I'm on my way to hell, and that they're enlightened or whatever. And the thing that's always scared me to and worried me is like I've been so worried. Really, I'm like, I do not want to turn out like my parents in a sense where I'm so unaware of myself that I will stay at an emotional maturity of like 16 years old.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like I'm so worried because like as I was talking to my therapist, I'm like, my parents are really emotionally immature. I've realized in the last like
Mm.
year. Because I read this book, I'm trying to read it. I think it's called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. And I
Yes.
I think it's great for like anyone to read, religious, who's grown up in religion or not. And just to understand the emotional development of your parents and what's going on in their minds and why they behave and do
Yeah.
things the way they do. Because for me, leaving Christianity, I'm like, I do have to find a way to get over these things and eventually forgive people. Because, yes, there are things in the Christian faith that are good. Of course, there are good teachings in it, like, um, there is love and like talk about patience. But as I tell my dad, I'm like, yes, I'm like, there are good things in the Bible, but I'm like, there are bad and awful things too. So for me, if I take advice from the Bible, I cherry pick, like, you know
Mm.
what I mean? There's some advice in the Bible that I think is good. It has good wisdom to offer, but it's like, I'm going to critically think through it and like think of the context of when this was written and how does it apply to me today in this day and
Mm.
age, and playing that in. And understanding too, it's like, okay, well, what have we discovered scientifically or psychologically? Because when this was written, there was psychology wasn't a
No.
thing. They were so unaware of themselves, and they had like a lot of the writers of the Bible had so many issues. But anyways, we won't get into that right now. But so to me, it's like, okay, it's like I I don't like, I'm not a Christian, but I don't have to be a Christian to take advice from
Yeah.
the Bible, some things. And like I'm exploring other religions too. Like I don't have to be a Buddhist to like listen to some Buddhist teachings otherwise.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just learning
It's the
through
beauty of
life.
being free, right?
Yeah, it's beautiful. I can like take from all these different things and apply them. And like, and I don't have to put so much pressure on myself to conform to this one standard or be one way. It's like, no, I have autonomy over my life. And like, it's just, I think I will be healing from religious trauma the rest of my life. And like, that's fine. And to me, my mantra is like progress, not
Yeah.
perfection. Because perfectionism was something I struggled with for so long. And it's like, you know what? If I am making progress every day, if I'm learning something new every day, expanding my mind, becoming a better person, then that is enough.
Mm.
And the awful thing is like, in these fundy environments, you're told a lot, you're a complete failure, that you fail God every single day, and you get to confess and be so sorry. And it's like, I'm like, it was just, to me, growing up was a toxic cycle of,
Yeah.
at first meeting standards, feeling shitty about it, feeling like a shitty person, praying, forgiving, asking God to forgive the awful things, and then feeling good again. Oh, and then doing something wrong, feeling shitty. It's like this is a cycle that goes over
Right.
and over again. And it's like, as I got older, I'm like, I'm not becoming better from this. I'm not growing. I'm like praying about these issues. Like there were some problems that I'm like, I shouldn't pray about this. I should actually take the autonomy and initiative to work through this on
Mm-hmm.
my own because I have the power to actually do that.
Yeah.
Like I'm not a helpless thing. And they try to make you think you're so helpless that you can't do it without God. And, I think the issue with that though, it can stop accountability.
Yeah.
I feel like if you're like, oh, well, I can't do this on my own, like, oh, I only need God, oh, like there's, or God didn't come through,
Yeah.
or something like this, or oh, I wasn't trusting God enough. It's like, and like that's the thing that annoys me too about Satan, which obviously I don't believe as like a literal being. It's a metaphor, but people were like, oh, I can't believe the devil had them do that to you, or I can't believe the devil's. I'm like, what
Right.
happened? What happened to your doctrine of free will and choices that you taught so much? And now the devil is the guy making people do all
Yeah.
these things. Like, where did that go?
Yeah. Not to mention all the things like, the devil can't, who could possibly be against me? I'm, got Christ in me, your spiritual armor, all these different things. Like, it's just so funny, right? Like, yeah, it's interesting, all this, like, I think it's really intriguing looking at, taking a zoom out and looking at society in forms of development. And you look at, maybe our parents, people in the church still, even in our age or whatever, that are at these maybe less mature, less developed stages psychologically. And that's not to say worse at all.
Yeah.
I think that it's really important to identify that people are at the stages of development they need to be. It's kind of a weird dynamic. And it's only when you are ready to move on that you move on. And so you wouldn't look at a 7-year-old and go, look at them, I don't know, just believing their parents when their parents say there's a Santa Claus and just accepting that. What an idiot. Why are they not using rational thought? And it's like, well, because they're 7, they don't really have those skill sets yet, and they don't need those skill sets yet. Like, life is still rosy and colorful, and let them enjoy it. It's going to go to shit soon when they wake up. But, it's this thing of like, this works for so many people. And I'm often blind to the fact to how much it worked for me a lot of the time as well. It did work for me for a very long time. And then it just didn't make sense anymore. Something clicked and I started to think more rationally. I started to be more autonomous. I started to care a bit more about like, I love being a part of a group, but also I don't like that I give up being me to be a part of this group. That's not okay. I want to be me. And it's really interesting that we look at certain stages of development can be very stagnating by default. And so, stages like this conventional stage that most religious people are at is very, it's all about staying still. In fact, a lot of the time it's about moving backwards, right? It's glorying the past and trying to move things back to what they used to be. But I think there is a danger as well that we do the same at our next stage, right? And so like we then raise our kids and we go, this is great. I'm not raising my kids in this weird environment where I tell you like, I'm the boss, everything I say is true. And if, everything the pastor says is true, everything this Bible text says is true, you can just have safety and security based on those things. That might be nice to have at one point in our lives as we're developing, having some stability, having some safety, knowing some people that we can trust, maybe mom and dad or a teacher or whatever. But they want to grow beyond that. And that's the beauty of maybe when we look at, you and I, people that have moved out of this, we're then raising the next generation. The question is, can we still go, but this is still a journey. And frankly, if we get them to where we are, that's a failure because they'll get to where we are by default, just existing in this space. We want them to get to the next stage and to go, Jesus, can you believe Phil and Andrew? What a bunch of idiots. They're always like stuck in their ways. They're not really moving forward. They're not great, because that's kind of how the human race moves and evolves, right? We do kind of start to slow down. We start to find our rhythm. We start to go, this is healthy for me. This works. And that's the weird part, right? Is that you can be in the IFB that, and it can work for you. And everyone's looking going, that's not working for you, dude. And you're like, no, it works for me. I don't care. Like, so what even working for you means is totally debatable, like, right? What's healthy for me, other people I look at and go, that you are not in a healthy space. You are not dealing with your emotions. You are not doing this. And yet for them, it really does work for them. It's not causing enough issues that they need to move on. And that's a hard space to, it's a hard thing to engage with, like recognizing like, my parents aren't going to move on and become super rational and autonomous. And they're not going to get where I'm coming from. And now I have to figure out, how do I talk to them knowing that? Because I kind of want to talk to them still.
I'm figuring that stuff out now too. Like, it's hard. And, that I think I would say, that I understand, I guess, what you're saying of how we do evolve to these certain stages and we stay there. And I think these fundamentalists, and we can even, the funny thing is we can leave fundamentalism, but we can't always take the fundamentalism out of us. So like, it's hard still to get rid of that, but it's just, we cannot view people and them in black and white. Like you're saying, what might work for someone might not work for someone else. And I think personally, I don't have an issue with I guess you would say religion. But my issue is when someone goes as far as to use their religion to, one, take away people's rights,
Yeah.
to cross boundaries, to force their beliefs onto other people, and to berate me and tell me I'm a horrible person for not doing that. And so to me, it's like, you know what? I'm like, there are some people that for some reason, as a psychological development they're at, they get something from this IFB movement. I'm like, you know, it is not for me. I've grown, I'm at a different stage in life. I'm like, there were different ways that it harmed me because of my sexual identity and my personality and different things. So I'm like, this is clearly giving them some comfort. And like, I'll have people sometimes message me, and like, I know that's literally your thing. It's like to help people deconstruct, and they'll come to me wanting answers. And
Mm.
like, I don't like that. I'm like, listen, I'm like, I cannot tell you that is like against everything I believe. I don't believe and just, this is how you do this. This is how you do that. I'm like, no, what I do for people, I was like, hey, I'm like, I believe the path is different for everyone. I tell people, I'm like, I left Christianity because that's what worked for me. And I'm like,
Right.
there is a benefit to religion for some people. And I'm like, that might be working for you. And you maybe can approach it in a different way if it's not working now. Because someone right now who is going to Bob Jones, they contacted me. They're like, I'm stuck in an IFB church and I hate it so much. So like, if this is Christianity, I want nothing to do with it. This is so terrible. And then like, people are telling me that I'm the issue, but here's some, it's like there's something like, I'm not growing as a person. It's stifling me, like I'm suffering. And he wanted me to give him all these answers, and I was like, listen, I was like, I just told him, I'm like, I'm not a Christian, I left it, but I'm like, if you want to stay in Christianity, I basically I gave him this long list of questions to ask and explore. I'm like, I found the answers to these questions. Go find them for yourself. Don't ask
Mm.
people to tell you what to think. Think for yourself critically. Like I'm like, that's a major step, is like taking
Yeah.
autonomy. And like, he thanked me. He's like, wow, I think I'm gonna dig into these questions for a while. And so he might look at totally different resources than I
Right.
read.
Yeah.
He might come to different conclusions
Yeah.
that I did. And that's fine if it works for him and it
Yeah.
makes his life better. And to me, it's like, it's all about a path of healing and living your best
Yeah.
life. And, you know, inherently, like, I do believe fundamentalist thinking is harmful to you psychologically.
Yeah.
And for some people, they're not mature enough to recognize that. And really, I feel like people who end up deconstructing, they do like a cost benefit, like
Right.
analysis type thing. And I feel like we've all done. And it's like, how does this really benefited me? And how much is this like harming me or costing me? And I think for some people, the fear of the afterlife is so great that that benefit of feeling secure about that,
Right.
knowing that, is enough for them.
Yeah.
And if that keeps them from going to the nut house, then fine. Or, you know, mental illness, you have to call it a nut house, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like, I shouldn't talk light of mental health because I've struggled with that, but it's just, you know, I've had several people message me and be like, oh, without Christianity, I'd just be in a nut house. I'd be in a mental institution. And the thing is, though, they're assuming because it does that for them, that anyone else who is not a part of it is like, more prone to danger or more prone
Yeah.
to being institutionalized. Or they're like, oh, so it's this assumption of, oh, it works for me, so it
Yeah.
must work for everyone. Um, like for me, I try to educate people on like mental health and psychological issues. And psychology is so complex. I don't think everyone has the same exact issue, if that makes sense.
No.
We all have like
Absolutely.
different issues because of the environment we grew in, because of our family history and things. It's not a black and white thing. So I don't go around people and telling them, oh, this is what you need to do to heal yourself. It's like, no, it's really just taking that autonomy and learning to trust yourself
Yeah.
and yourself and explore and find and know what is true to you, because what you believe or what you don't believe or whatever, like, it has to be personal to you.
Yeah.
And people will slide in my DMs, um not too often, but sometimes like preaching the gospel or throwing at me, or like there are some things that is triggering, and I'm like, and there are sometimes I just delete it and I ignore it.
Yeah.
And there was one person like messaged me because I posted something about I don't know, the transgender rights issue in Texas.
Right.
And they messaged me, they were like, do you believe that there are two genders, or that we're born with a gender at birth, or blah 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 blah? And they wanted me to tell them what I believed about gender and stuff, or what I knew at least about gender. And so I didn't even answer the question. And I told them it does not matter what I believe. I'm like, if your beliefs are causing you to harm humanity, that is not okay. I'm like, people matter more than beliefs. So I'm like, transgender rights should be protected because
Mm.
people matter more than beliefs. And like, I don't care if you think that's science or that's scientific or whatever. These arguments, they pull science out of their pockets, or try
Right.
to.
Yeah.
Everyone,
A
it's
group that has been well known to disassociate from science their entire
most
lives, right?
the entire lives like, oh, they just whip it out of their pocket, and they're like, oh well, and then they'll say, oh, well, this is what a Bible verse says, and I'm like,
Yeah, that doesn't mean anything to me.
no, it's like, no, I don't care. Like,
Right. It's like kid pulling out, like, I read this in like, like Spot the Dog Went to the Zoo. And you're like, yeah,
yeah,
that doesn't mean anything to me. That's a kid's book, It's
and
like, eh.
you know, and it's so sad growing up in church and saying like, oh, like if a girl has a vagina, it's a girl, if a boy has a penis, boy or whatever, that's it. It's like they have their genital, and it's like gender is much deeper than what's on your
Right.
body.
Yeah.
Like, and gender is something I want to dig into and learn more because I'm not educated on it. That's
Yeah.
another thing. So I'm not going to talk much about that because I'm not educated on it. But
Yeah.
I believe human rights and human beings matter so much more than
Yeah.
belief systems or beliefs. And so whenever I have those people attack me for like like being vocal
Yeah.
about trans rights, I'm like, listen, I'm like, my life motto is humanity over dogma.
Yeah.
Like every day, I will always put humanity over dogma
Yeah.
because people matter so much more. And like, I value people so much more that I've left fundamentalist Christianity,
Mm.
which has really blown my mind because I still had those fears of like, what if I do go down the slippery slope that they talk about, and that I am going to end up in this terrible, awful place. And I guess for me, it was so terrible to stay in it that the other option I risked. And like I ended up everything being okay now. Like, you know what
Mm.
I mean? Like I made it, like, I mean, I look back and like it's blown my mind of how the things I used to believe and the things that I've deconstructed, and even things that I'm still deconstructing and like taking apart. And there are some days where it's harder for me to understand. I'm like, why do people believe this anymore? Like, you
Mm.
know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you get to this point psychologically of maturing, and like you can't really understand that anymore, even
Yeah.
though you're in that
You
place, and
can't remember what it was like to be like that,
you
for
can't
sure.
remember what it was like. And it's like, and like to me, like I try so hard to have empathy, and like to me, if I do have a hard time with empathy, like I'm a very empathetic person anyways, but if there are some things I'm like, okay, I'm like, let me understand psychologically from their level. And like psychology has really helped me let go of that, I guess you would say, bitterness and
Mhm.
hurt of what my parents did, because it made me understand that they have very wounded inner children, and they were very undeveloped psychologically because of their upbringing,
Yeah.
their beliefs. So it's like, not that any of those things excuse their behavior or diminishes
Yeah.
it, but I think that understanding of that side can help you move on things.
Yeah. At
And
least
like,
individually, for sure. Like, I
yeah,
think you raise an interesting point about the fact that someone gets in my DMs and starts yelling at me about trans rights, or about why I don't believe in God or something, whatever they think I believe. I don't tell people what I believe, but they decide
I
what
don't
I believe
either.
anyway, and they yell at me.
Yes.
Um, and
Yeah.
9 times out of 10, I used to chat with people like that and be like, hey, okay, so why do you think like that? Like, what, let me ask you some questions and just like help them process a bit, and then be like, okay, on you go. But now I'm just like, I just don't have time. I'm busy. I don't
Yeah.
have the mental space to chat with people that don't
Yeah.
want to. And most as well, 90% of the time, they don't want to actually talk. They don't want
No,
to
they
listen. They don't want to have a conversation. They just
yeah.
want to convert you, which is not going to happen.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's a dynamic as well where it's like, I'm not going to convert you. So I'm like, okay, delete, block, restrict, whatever. Now, there's a difference between that and we are a church that's actively harming a group of people, LGBTQ. Great example. People growing up in that church are now more likely to self-harm, commit suicide, have depression, have anxiety, feel feelings of overwhelm, end up in full-time mental care, all sorts of stuff are more likely because you're in that church. Now, this is where the American Europe divides, and I'm speaking very much as a white European here who doesn't know the rest of the world. I couldn't comment on what it's like in Asia, in Oceania, in Africa, and different parts of the world. I couldn't comment, but I do know the difference having lived in England, in Europe, and in America. There's a weird dynamic where in Europe they just go, well, this is harmful and abusive, so it's illegal. You can't do that anymore. Now, they haven't, to be fair, made it illegal for churches to, not be okay with gay people or something like that.
Yeah.
But it is pretty illegal to talk major hate speech from the pulpit now, which, it would be common things that people talk about in America. It's illegal for conversion therapy and has been illegal for conversion therapy for a very long time here. Maybe not very long. Very long's not fair, but
long enough.
A decent amount of time compared to a lot of other places. And so you look at some of these things and you go, it's really, at the end of the day, these people are not going to. I look back at when I was in that place, I wasn't going to just suddenly accept gay people. The Bible says gay people are bad, or gay people go to hell, or gay people are an abomination. Or you can't just tell me like, well, you have to accept people, or you can't say, well, that's a bit harsh to gay people. Have you thought about how that hurts them? And I'm like, no, I'm thinking about the Bible, right? I mean, from that fundamental perspective, you're not convincing me to do otherwise. It's only when you have major repercussions, the government step in and go, this is the rules. I talk about this occasionally about clergy abuse. And so there's a major international study on clergy abuse. And so they basically found that clergy abuse is rife. It's everywhere. It's all over the world. It's across every denomination, every religion. And they were like, one of the main things. So they gave like a list of like, here's some advice for people that are in the space of clergy. These are some things you could do to reduce it. And so one of the things was like, you have to put a window on your office that the reception, the rest of the church can look in. So if you're meeting with someone one-on-one, there's a window into your office. And what's interesting is in some countries throughout Europe, they made that a law. They legislated it. They said, yeah, that's a good rule. Yeah, let's just make that a rule. And they did. And you know what happened? Clergy abuse dropped. You know what happened in America? They went, not in my America. You're not putting a window on my office. And clergy abuse still is more rife in America than it is in Europe.
And
so it looks like, so my point being, I guess, is there's this weird dynamic in America where you are so never make laws for reducing my rights, never make laws forcing the church to do something. And yet we're seeing in the last few months, there's mass laws being petitioned to take away the rights of those that are being massively persecuted and abused and hurt and harassed. And so it's a weird dynamic where I don't know how much the church is ever going to change if they can't be legislated against. And yet they're now even like so far in the cognitive dissonance that they're going to fight for laws that uphold their very powerful views because they're so scared. They're so threatened by the idea that a gay person might be able to talk about their sexuality at school, or a trans person might have access to a bathroom. Like, that's so scary to them. A trans person might be able to undergo, hormone therapy. Like, that's so scary to them, they'll institute a law. But when they're told, you doing this causes people to kill themselves, could we maybe tone it down? They're like, not a chance, no way. It's such a fascinating dynamic that I don't know how you engage with someone that's on that level to help them see that harm is what's going on, and why. And you can't get them to see a person is more important than that rule. That rule is everything. It's a wild dynamic that it's quite uniquely American in some ways at times, but maybe not. At least within an American European bubble, I will say. And Western European at that as well.
in America, like I was talking with someone recently, I'm like, because I was talking to someone about vaccines, of course, and they were like, well, yeah, they're like, I cannot believe my parents buying into this and just getting a vaccine. Like, oh my gosh, just being willing to give up their rights. Like, they barely even tested this. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, I think they're trying to think of the greater good. And like I told this person, I was like, I think you have such a more of an individualistic mindset,
Mm.
and they have more of a collectivistic mindset, collectivism, and they care about the community. And you seem to me care more about individuals.
Mm.
And they were like, wow, they're like, we shouldn't give up our rights. Our country wasn't founded on that. And like, I understand these arguments of like, we've always struggled in America of that line of the separation of church and state, of church, religion staying out of government and government staying out of church.
Right.
But the problem with that is, though, and I recently made a post or a quote about this, is that countless children across the US are abused under the guise of religious freedom.
Right.
Because they can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah. And it's like, of course, there are laws in the US that, if someone is sexually abused and someone goes to the police, well, they're going to arrest that person. It doesn't matter what their religious beliefs are. If they use religion to abuse someone, like that is against the law. They're violating human rights. And so sorry, like that doesn't matter. So I think the struggle is that finding a way to make these environments safer with more regulation, which they do not want at all. They don't want any.
I mean, God, they got upset about you being told, hey, if you got a vaccination that we've tested and tried and it's been used all over the world, and most people that are experts in vaccinations seem to think it's safe, it would mean that your friends would be safe, your family would be safe, that people wouldn't be harmed. They're like, no, you cannot force me. And I'm like, whoa, we just said, do you want it? Like at first, like, it's just like, how on earth you start legislating things that are really, I mean, the Bible's not even talking about vaccinations. They only care about vaccinations because like fucking Trump said something, or, some QAnon or something, probably somewhere along the lines. They're not even, or, Jenny McCarthy or whatever. It goes back that far to the autism vaccinations and stuff. Oh my God. But yeah, I mean, when that is something you can't talk about, there is no way they're starting to go, something like homosexuality, which they've loved to make a deal of, especially in the last few decades. Like it's been a huge deal. It's been so linked to faith.
And like something that there are organizations in the US and people that have like their main purpose is to help make churches safer. And like I know, and like obviously not all churches are going to take that advice. I know there somewhere, I can't remember who did it, but like someone has like a spiritual abuse guideline or just abuse guideline just to watch out for in your church. You can be aware and watch out for these things. And I think it just goes back to that we want that place that's a safe haven, and have the illusion that it's safe and it's fine and like we can do whatever we want. And people, even when like sexual abuse scandals happen, the church members can be in denial about it.
Oh, big time, right?
Big time. And, it is that struggle of like,
it's because we don't believe in the dark. We don't believe in the shadow. So a pastor can only be good. He can't be, because the thing is, most of these pastors that are abusing someone or hurting someone, they probably are nice people to you. Yeah.
Yes.
They probably are nice to be around. They maybe do have some wisdom to share with you on a Sunday. They maybe do understand their Bible. Maybe they do help an old lady cross the road and not cheat on their taxes. That one's definitely debatable. But yes, they can also harm someone sexually. These are not independent. You can be a really good person and do some really, really horrendous things. And you can be a really bad person and do some great things.
Two things can be true at the same time. Is like that black and white thinking though stops them from even considering that. And like right now, I've pondered and thought, I'm like, what can we actually do to fix these issues in these churches without really, obviously I do believe, in free speech. So it's like, it's such a hard area to go into, you know what I mean? It's like, if I feel like if one part of speech is taken away, why can't they take away other parts? Like, is that kind of back to that dogma thing of like, who is the authority to say what you can or cannot say?
Yeah.
And to me personally, obviously, I hated that pastors say hateful things in the pulpit. But technically free speech covers that and they should be allowed to do that. But my issue is when that individual child is forced to go to that church by their parents, or when that child is forced to go into conversion therapy, that crosses a line. That child is being forced to do something. And it's like, you know what, if that pastor wants to be hateful, fine. I won't be around that. I'll leave, I'll go to a healthy environment, but kids can't do that.
Yeah.
And I think really what I hope for, which I hope children will start to get more rights as we progress in America, in the world, because I do not think children have enough rights, because I think
especially in Christian environments, because children are possessions.
They are possessions. And so I look back in my childhood, and there were times if I would have been given the decision, I would have said, I am not going to this church. Right. I had the maturity at that time to know deep down inside that it was causing me harm. I might not have known all the specifics because, I wasn't intelligent enough or developed enough, but I knew that it was harming me. But the more I resisted, the more I was made to go to church and things were shoved down my throat. So it's like, you eventually learn to just shut down and be compliant, because you learn the more you fight, the harder they're going to make it on you. Yeah. And so to me, it's like, in order to make our churches safer, children need to have more rights.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, though, too, the problem is with this homeschooling and the fundamentalist movement is that they don't have any other adults to go to. So there is something bad going on. What? They're stuck at home when they're stuck at. And so, I know to a lot of people and parents out there, is like, I think, some might see it as radical, but I am against homeschooling, most definitely. Like, I am not there at all. And I don't think it's healthy or good. It's rarely a good thing, I think. And like, I've known families who have done homeschooling and it's been great because their parents were good, healthy, balanced people who generally wanted a good education, and they continue to get them involved outside of religious settings and other things.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if sometimes parents might think they're doing the right thing for their children, but they're not at all. And it's so important to have those different environments of other adults that a child could go to and say something is going wrong. Because think about all the children who have gone to schools and a teacher has noticed that maybe there are bruises or something's going wrong.
Absolutely.
Or
the fact that, I don't know exactly what it's like in America, but certainly in the UK, it's legislated. Kids are regularly talked to and explained to, these are things that are okay to happen in the home. These are things that are not okay. If you ever feel like that, these are the people that you can go and talk to. They're always here to talk to if you want. And actually, they will regularly have meetings where they check in with you and go, hey, are you okay? What's going on? Like, tell me about your life at home. Like, that can't happen in a homeschool, especially when it's like, mom's beating the shit out of you and she's the one responsible to tell you, hey, if someone's beating the shit out of you, that's not okay. Well, in America, it is okay to beat the shit out of your kids. It's legal.
Yeah, it is.
But like, or someone's abusing you, sexually or whatever it might be, that maybe is more clear cut. I can imagine some people still being like, oh, it's okay to spank your kids or whatever. But that's again, this thing of like, we don't like laws. We don't like that. What you're going to indoctrinate my kids, telling them that if someone's doing this to them, it's not okay. Well, that's ridiculous, and it's like,
Yeah. Mhm.
Again, it goes all the way back to the pastor, like the university not wanting you to talk to the media. It's like, you have a problem with us
Uh-huh.
talking to kids saying, here's some red flags if adults in your life are doing this. You don't want us to do that. What the fuck are you doing with your kids? Right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, that's the first question you got to ask. It's like, wait,
Yeah.
why are you not? Because any
Yeah.
healthy adult goes, I want my kids to know that they're safe, have someone to talk to. If my kid's getting abused and I don't know about it and they're scared to tell me, I want them to have someone that it might feel safe to tell.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's yeah, it's just bizarre, these
It
things
is.
that, but it is important that property has as little autonomy and choices as possible.
Yeah.
And really the Christian ethos is that children are property right
Yeah. And
through.
like, really, that's honestly how I felt growing up. And really, I especially thought that's how my dad viewed me. I'm like, I'm just a mini him, really. I'm
Mm,
like, that's how he sees me. I'm just something he can tell what to do, who to be. Like he like put himself as a representative of God. I mean, that's what they do in the patriarchal form, is that, the man is like representing God. So like if you disobey him, you're disobeying God. So it's like there's so much fear and shame.
yeah.
The issue is if the man is corrupt, that really distorts your view of like a higher power, most definitely.
Yeah.
And like religion, it can definitely be very, very traumatizing. And I think, for homeschooling, like in the US, it's in law, okay, so they cannot legislate federally how to make how to regulate homeschooling. So homeschooling laws are different in each state in the
Yeah.
US. Because I think somewhere it's a constitution where the government can't decide um, these like foundational things for like education, which even though there's such thing as public schools, like I don't get, but like it's state. It's interesting because I think like the federal government pays the state, and then the state then disperses whatever. So like there are some states where a social worker will visit a house every once in a while
Right.
to make sure, and which I think is a great thing, that social
Yeah.
workers should definitely be every once in a while checking up on these things. But like the issue is in most states, not all of them, that usually the bare minimum is that you have to register yourself as a homeschool, so the state is aware of your existence and that you have you're homeschooling, you have children at home. So that's usually the bare minimum. Sometimes the issue is, though, there are homeschoolers that don't even do that, and the state has no idea that these children exist and that they're not really in school. And like there were some people from my church where their children were like 9, 10, 11 years old, and they were not doing schoolwork. They were working for their parents
Mm,
at like their local store or whatever, helping their business, using child labor basically. And I'm like, part of me is like, I really, really want to call like social services and like have them
right.
come to the house. And like, this is not okay. Like, depriving your child of an education
Right.
is abuse. Not
Yeah.
giving your child life skills is abuse. Like, making your child work for you is abuse. Like, that's
Yeah.
child labor, not like, oh my God. Like, when I heard stories of that the state had no idea, and that these children probably the rest of their lives will probably be illiterate and not have
Yeah.
any idea how to read, how to do anything or integrate into
Yeah.
society.
Which
Like
creates more of the same, right? So
yeah,
then they grow up and they have kids and they're scared of their kids going to school because they were taught to
yeah,
demonize it and they aren't equipped to teach. Like,
yeah.
it's astonishing to me.
Mhm.
My wife's a teacher. She trained, she just got a master's in teaching. She had to
Mhm.
train for multiple years being observed as a teacher
Yeah.
every week
Mhm.
and being marked and getting feedback
Yeah.
constantly by her
Mhm.
peers.
Yeah.
Um, and mentors and like it's a very long process to
Mhm.
learn that, and that's at a primary school level, so that's up to the age of 11 in this country.
Yeah.
You
Mhm.
just to teach basic math, English,
Yeah.
science, and
Mhm.
whatever else they do, a bit of history here, a bit that, like,
Yeah.
it's and so everyone goes, yeah, I could teach a 10-year-old math. And I'm like, the thing is, most people can actually, if you sit down and go, okay, what is a number?
Mhm.
Well, what's a number? how do you teach someone that's never thought of what a number is, what a number is? Because I can point to one thing and say one, and I can point to two things and say two, but not really understands what counting or numbers are. And this is actually, there's been studies of this where they actually sit down with 8, 9-year-olds that can do their 12 times table and do multiplication, but can't actually count. And so like, if you break them out of that mold, and so how on earth are we expecting a random person to do this up to the age of 18?
That is so true.
It's like, terrifying, because teaching is a skill. It's not about the topic. It's about the skill of teaching as well as the topic.
Yes. And like, that does what I meant too, because like you're saying, we have these high standards for these public schools and private schools. But then homeschooling is like, oh, you have the right to do whatever you want with your children. Like, well, that's scary. Like,
oh man. And America, man. Oh my gosh, it's next level. It every time I'm just constantly like, oh yeah, that exists. That's a thing. But then I was laughing about this in the last podcast I recorded, maybe 2 podcasts ago. I've recorded a lot of podcasts in this 1 week, but I just read this study that the UK government did looking at Americans and how they see other Americans. And so they grabbed like, I don't know what it's like, 10,000 Americans, had them do surveys, and they basically asked what percentage of American adults are, and then they fill the gap, like black. So obviously 13%. The average response was 42%. The average American thinks 42% of America are black. Problem. Next, what about live in New York City? The average American thinks 30% of adult Americans in America live in New York City. What? Transgender. The average American thinks that adult Americans, 24% are transgender.
What?
Right. I mean, you're looking at, and what's fascinating is obviously,
I didn't know this. Wow.
This is a brand new study, and it highlights that there are averages are fascinating, right? Because we all like to think we're above average. But the definition of average means we're probably somewhere near the middle, right? So you might be above average in some areas, but like average is a scary concept, because this is the average American thinks these things. So it actually means that a lot of Americans think even more than that, which is terrifying. Because you've got to assume that a good chunk of Americans are educated, know, like what's going on, blah, blah, blah. A lot of people with this, like they're college educated and they're giving like wild answers, like that 28% are Muslim in America. And you're like, what? Like, are you kidding? Where? And so what it highlights, what they found that the more, the higher the percentage you think of your population are different than you, the more you demonize them. And so what they were saying is, what's interesting is there's narratives in America that make you think that there are more people that aren't like you. So there's more transgenders. And so now I'm pushed to demonize. I gotta fight the transgenders. 1 in 4 people are transgender, right? Like, it's like, I've gotta fight the gays. I've gotta fight the Muslims because they're taking over. And you hear this language a lot. And of course, they actually do think that they're taking over. They do think that there's 30%, 25%. And of course, these numbers are usually in the single digits. They're tiny percentages, a lot of them. And they did other things like what percentage of Americans own a car and different things. And it showed how much privilege was there, where they thought like 90% of Americans have a car, and it's much lower than that, but it just highlights again, like there's a wild disparity in
perception
in education, and that leads to a wide disparity in perception, which leads to these radicalized positions where we demonize people groups that are, it's like the white evangelicals think they're a minority. Are they fucking kidding? Like, you know what I mean? But they genuinely see themselves, again, that was on the list, and they saw themselves as a minority. They thought it was only a small percentage, like 25% or so. I can't remember the numbers on that one, but it was low. And I'm like, well, of course you do. You think, 30% are Muslim and 28% are Hindu, or, I don't know what it was, but you're just like, yeah, of course you think you're they thought, I think it was like 36% are atheists, when it's like I think it's like 5% or something in America identify as atheists.
Wow.
It's so low. But I think a lot of that is stigma and different components as well. But
yeah, most definitely.
It's bizarre. But yeah, so I just think you look at things like homeschooling, and you look at the type, like at the end of the day, I know a ton of smart people that homeschool, and I know a ton of people that are really very educated in child development, and and know how to raise a kid in a really healthy way, giving them amazing emotional intelligence, giving them a very well-rounded education that maybe is better than the public school could do for them. But that parent is the outlier. And most parents that want to homeschool, they all want to do it because they think they can do a better job. But the amount of people that can do a better job, probably very, very small. The amount of people that think they can do a better job, but actually it's probably a very strong indicator that they can't, right?
Yeah.
The fact that you think the public school is so bad probably indicates that you're biased against what public education is.
Yes. It scares me because once the pandemic happened, homeschooling like grew in like record rates. Parents wanting to control their children's education, and they're so defensive of homeschooling in America. I remember growing up in a homeschool group, and there were times like every year our group would visit. At the time I lived in North Carolina, so the capital is Raleigh. So we would go to Raleigh every year to talk to like different legislators to make them or convince them to support homeschooling. Because there are times when laws that try to regulate homeschooling or make it better or safer for children, the parent sees that as taking their autonomy. Yeah. Really. And my issue is that, what, your child has autonomy. Like, what is your child?
Yeah.
What is your child?
But even that, what does that even mean? What does your child want? Have you talked to a kid that's grown up in a fundamental home that has only been homeschooled? What they want, they don't really know. They've been
no.
It's me and Till watched this funny documentary recently. So we watched a documentary where they look at these different scenarios, and they were sitting with this family that are extremely radicalized, don't trust the state, don't whatever, and they're in the UK, and they don't homeschool their kids, but they homeschool their kids, but they don't school them at all because they don't believe in education as a model like that should be really done. And the person that's doing the documentary, this woman, she's sitting with this like 7-year-old, and she's like, so you could choose to go to school or not. Your mom and dad said you had the choice. And they're like, yeah. And she's like, so why didn't you choose to go to school? And she's like, and this kid, like 6 or 7 years old, goes, everyone that goes to school are just sheep. They don't think for themselves. And I'm like,
no,
I don't know if a 6-year-old's kind of developed that kind of language or thought in a vacuum, right? So has that kid really, do they understand what their parents even mean by they are sheep? And they don't think, they're like, they're just parroting what their parents believe. Maybe when the time you're 15, 16, you might have a bit more. But even the concept of children can, even if, because I guarantee a lot of people that homeschool their kids go, well, we give our kids a choice. We say to them, what do you want to do? And a lot of them are going to choose to be in homeschool because the public school is dangerous. It's evil. They have knife crime and gun crime. And there's all the black kids are there and they're dangerous. Or, wild. And I do want to identify that we are being very critical of people that homeschool. And there are lots and lots and lots of people that homeschool really well. I had a great person on my show a while back that does homeschooling. And they've integrated some deconstruction. They've decolonized history and do lots of really great stuff. So this isn't solely about that homeschooling is bad, just like it isn't about that all church is bad. But it's that these things unregulated, without looking at it nuanced, without thinking about it carefully, can be really harmful institutions and ultimately are designed to stunt growth rather than encourage it. Right. And most people want their kids in school, but in a homeschool, so they don't think for themselves. So they don't get exposed to different ideas.
Yes. And like, I think it comes back to like two things can be true at the same time. Like, I get tired of Christians posting statistics of things like, oh my gosh, people who go to church have so much higher mental health. And I was like, yes, maybe so, but like, have you looked at statistics of the LGBTQ plus community, how it gets worse for them? Like, they don't consider everyone. They're like, oh, well, since this is a high percentage, all of the church is good. And I'm like, I'm like, two things can be true at the same time. The church can be doing a lot of good, and the church can also be doing a lot of bad. Yeah. And just like with homeschooling, a lot of people can be doing good with the homeschooling, and a lot of people can be doing bad.
Yeah.
And so it's learning to have those regulations to help the bad, really,
Yeah.
and to make sure that everyone has equal opportunities. And like, to me, it's like if a parent sees their child struggling in school and they cannot help them in homeschooling get better, they need to put them in some kind of
Yeah.
school. And like, even like socialization,
Yeah.
like,
Huge deal. I mean, the amount of homeschool kids I've met that I'm like, whoa, this is like talking to an alien. It looks like this is your first interaction with another human. Like, what's happening right now?
like, for me, it was such a socialization was such a struggle for me. And like, I had to like basically integrate myself into society and just learn from trial and error how to deal with, like, yes, technically I was socialized in the church and homeschooling, but that's not the same thing. You know what I
No.
mean? It's
Yeah.
a whole different breed of people. They're not like they're not diverse, if that makes sense. I
Yeah.
was around very similar people who believe the same things,
Yeah.
basically. And so I needed diversity of views and people in my life. So like, working at a fast food restaurant was like my way from that. It was like throwing myself out into a completely different environment. It was good for me.
Yeah.
It was good. And like, I know for many years I worked so hard on socializing. I think, part of my personality made that harder because I was more of an introvert. So like, homeschooling helped me avoid people a lot,
Yeah.
really. And eventually I'm like, I have to like, I gotta have life skills. Like,
Mm.
I had to interact, I had to collaborate with people and get along and understand, like, we need connection too. We need community. So I'm like, I can't just do this. And
Yeah.
recently in Greenville, where I live now, I saw someone in a coffee shop that I met a couple of years ago at Bob Jones, who's still there. And like you said, it's like that talking to an alien type moment where it's like they have no idea. And it's like, it just made me so uncomfortable inside. I'm like, this poor person. And then I realized, like, this was me
Yeah.
literally like 5 years ago. It's like, this poor thing is in college. And it was
It
this
must be
coffee shop.
so scary. I mean, even a Christian college like Bob Jones, like,
Yeah.
because the thing is, it is a thing of like, you can only shelter someone for so long. The real world exists, and at some point, I mean, maybe
Yeah.
not. Maybe if you go into a family business and your business only does business with other Christians in the church or something, or you're, like the pastor's kid, and you're going to be the pastor next, or there's maybe some real niche scenarios where you're not going to have to be exposed to the real world. But like, I remember, because again, in the UK, homeschooling is very rare. It's becoming more popular. I think, especially through the pandemic, it's become a bit more interesting, the discussion. But the level of education in the UK is so much higher than in America as well, with things like that as well. So maybe that would play in and make it a bit better. I don't know. I still am like, I don't know. My wife's a teacher, and every now and again we're like, we could homeschool a kid, and it's like, I don't think it'd be healthy though. I still think we'd be, I don't know. I just want them to have more diversity in their life. But I have met people over here that have been homeschooled, and there's been times where I'm like, I'm stepping on eggshells because I feel like I might break you, like genuinely. Like, I remember one time I met this girl that was about my age, and I think I swore or something. I said fuck or something, and she literally like turned around and ran away in the middle of a conversation. And I was like, and I didn't even know what happened. Because I'm Scottish, I say fuck every 10 seconds. I'm like, wait, what did I just do? Because I'm also an awkward teenager, and I'm like, I don't know how to interact with girls or other people in general. I'm autistic, there's all sorts of different things that were backed against me as socially. But I was like, what just happened? And I found out later it's because I had said fuck in a sentence, and she just literally turned and ran away. And I'm like, she was like 16, 17. I'm like, you should be able to deal with the fact that some people in this world are going to say something you don't like, right? I mean, like, you might still go, I don't like that, and I'm not going to cuss or whatever. Yeah, sure. But
great reaction.
It's like, it was funny. Like, looking back, it still makes me laugh. Like, it was like a comedy sketch or something, like, it's amazing, like an SNL skit or something.
Oh God. Wow.
But it's just not setting people up for success. And it's the same deal with the church. It doesn't set people up for success in a world that has moved on developmentally, like, generally speaking, those outside the church. And also, I want to touch on this because this is really interesting. You mentioned that people outside the church have lower mental wellness, but there's so much nuance to that when you go, well, people in the church are taught to bypass mental wellness. So when you do a survey and say to someone in the church, do you feel healthy? Do you feel
Yeah.
happy? Are you
Yeah.
content? The default is you have to say yes. You're a Christian. You
Yeah.
are. And also, when you go, do you feel depression? It's like, nope, I don't do that. I just pray. Every time I feel down, I just pray. And it's like, oh, so you do
Yeah.
feel down. You just aren't acknowledging that, and you aren't
Yes.
digging into it. And
Yeah.
then what's interesting is that statistic falls on its ass really quick when you look at secular societies. So in America, this holds up well, that people
Yeah.
outside of the church have lower mental wellness index, and actually lower physical index, and actually also die earlier. So sorry.
Yeah.
But that's true. It is true that if you have, but what's interesting about America is most people grew up in the church still. Even those people that are outside the church grew up in
Oh,
church. And so
yeah.
actually, in societies where people have grown outside of the church from birth, what's
Uh-huh.
interesting is they score similar to those in the church, but people that have left the church still have those low numbers. And so what's really
Okay.
interesting is what's really bad for your mental health is leaving church, apparently.
Yeah.
That's the one that hits you because you've got some shit to deal with, and you've repressed
Yeah.
everything, and you've not
And
looked at things. Whereas
yeah.
growing up outside of church as a agnostic kid, atheist kid in a
Yeah.
family, you're probably taught to look at your mental health. You're probably taught to deal with some of
Yeah.
that shadow stuff.
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
healthier.
I see that too. I understand that because I hate it when pastors generalize people who leave the church. And they're like, oh, they do this and this and this. But the issue is they don't actually want to know the core issues of it. They just want to push their religion. Be like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, our religion is right. This is why. But when you said that people who grew up in religion and leave it can have bad mental health, it makes me think of, oh, religious trauma. Like
Right.
they're working through their trauma that they endured in the church, and just lack of learning emotional skills. Like, for me, I was so emotionally dependent on religion. It was really hard for me to get away from it. And for me personally, my mental health has been much better since being expelled back in January. I didn't realize how dysregulated my nervous system was. I knew it was, but I didn't know how to the full extent of the effect it took on my mind and body. Because like you've been in that in your whole life.
Yeah.
It's your reality. So then when you get out of that and like you're able to be in a safe environment, it's like, oh my gosh, like that caused me so much harm. But I think the hard thing about leaving church is that you have that certainty for years and then you don't anymore.
Yeah.
And you needed to form your worldview earlier, but then you're having to form it later.
Right.
And and that's so hard to do. So I really do hate it when Christians use statistics to push their agenda, because they're not looking at everything.
Yeah.
They're not looking at the fine details or the causes, or maybe, like you said, people are dishonest. Like it makes me think of that toxic Christian positivity thing
Yeah.
I was in church.
Yeah.
Like I found out, which I'm working on in therapy, is that when I get sad, my sadness is so bad because I have shame about being sad. And if I just remove that shame, being sad wouldn't see such a horrible thing, really. And most of the why my sadness is so debilitating and depression is that there's so much shame around negative emotions. So that's one thing I'm working through in therapy, is like, you know what? I'm sad, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Why am I sad? What's going on in my life? How long is this going to last? What is happening? Like really critically working through it. And like journaling has worked wonders for me for working through these moods. It's like, why do I feel shame about this? Why do I feel shame about being sad? Like this is a normal human emotion. Like I can't be happy about being sad, and vice versa, these duality of things. So it's like, you know what I mean? So learning really that it's okay to be human. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's really hard when you grow up in these churches and you're taught to just self-annihilate. Your psychological, emotional, intellectual, mental growth is just stunted. And then you're thrown out and you leave and you throw yourself to the world. You have no idea how to deal with anything. And of course, your mental health goes down because you have no tools, because they were never given to you.
Absolutely.
how do you expect these people to
Yeah.
be better when you've taught them to be so dependent on you? These people can't even trust themselves,
Yeah.
how to deal with themselves. What do you expect?
Yeah.
And it just frustrates me. And it's like, to me, and I think we were talking earlier, is education is really the key to fixing a lot of issues. Because what if our parents would have been educated in psychology and mental health and how to emotionally regulate?
Yeah.
Think
Big
about how
time.
they would have changed their parenting, having this more holistic view of life all around, these different worldviews and approaches to things, and understanding the complexities of life, which can be uncomfortable, but it's a reality. And applying black and white thinking to a complex world just doesn't work. Doesn't work
No.
well.
Yeah.
Anyone, either side.
Yeah.
And, and I understand too that there are issues with public schools in America. And like, I definitely do believe,
Yeah. Especially in America, right? I mean,
especially in America. And so I understand why parents are like, oh my God, these schools, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yes. But then again, like we were talking about, people need to be qualified to teach children. And like, the problem is, okay, just because you let your child go to public school doesn't mean you can't help them with homework or help to learn at home.
right. Yeah.
Like, what's stopping you from helping your child at home? Which, of course, work. I understand. Like, Americans are, we try to do so many things. I feel like
Mhm.
there's so much pressure, which it's frustrating because, I'm 21 years old and I'm not engaged or married. And like, and like
Right.
the Christian community in America, it's like, oh, like you got to get your college degree and then you get married, kids, and you work a full-time job the rest of your life and you die. And to me, that just sounds so terrible. Like, I just rather
Yeah.
die right now. And like, for me, it's like, you know what? If other people want to do that, that's fine. But I don't want to follow that method. Do I want to get a college degree? Yes. Do I get a master's? Yes. So I'm get a doctorate? Yes. Like, I have all these goals in life, but like, I feel like for me, I've learned not to chase happiness, but to chase purpose,
Mm.
really. And really, I think that's what has made my life really a lot more satisfying. And like, finding purpose outside of religion is, and I think personality do has a lot to do with that too, because like,
Yeah.
I'm an INFJ, so like, we are naturally like activists and advocates for people. We have that. And so I think it was just easier and natural for me to find purpose in my life. And there are some personality types that find that very difficult.
Yeah.
And I think these religions draw, or they draw to these religions because it kind of gives them that, oh, well, this is a purpose. This is something that I can do. And so, and I still get frustrated when people are like, oh, like, how can you have purpose without the church? Or like you were saying, how can you have morals without the church? And we're talking about this psychological development and just growing and realizing, like, I know earlier you were talking about how, why don't you just go around and do all these terrible, awful things all the time? And it's like, people understand the causes of their actions. And it's like,
Mm.
you would have to be an absolute maniac to enjoy causing violence
Right.
to someone else.
Yeah.
And just
You
to
would
go
have
on.
to have so much trauma and so
Yes.
much like warped kind of worldview to
Yeah,
do that.
you
Like,
would.
I don't think it's possible otherwise.
And like,
Yeah.
I remember, like, I think it was like my junior year at Bob Jones, that I don't usually get in arguments with people, but this time I decided to, because it had been like 2 years I already been there. So I was beginning my junior year, and like, I worked in this the photography studio, and like, there was always also a lab monitor there. And like, I had gotten COVID-19 the fall of 2020. And so I was out of work for a while. Like, I think it was like I was in quarantine for like 2 weeks. Then I came out, and there's this one girl that was at the desk. And I came back and I was like, oh yeah, I was gone. I was like, I was sick. I had COVID. I'm fine now. And it was so weird because she talked to me. She's like, oh, she's like, did you miss church? And like, I wasn't really sure what she meant, like physically, or did I like emotionally? I was
Right.
like, well,
Emotionally miss it.
Yeah, so I was like, I was like, of course I had to quarantine, but I'm like, no, I didn't. And like, usually I lie to people in that
Right.
environment. Like, I have to conform, be like, oh my gosh, like yes. And like, at that point, I was so tired of being fake. Like, I was the person that I despised and I hated it. You know what I mean? I was the hypocrite, I
Right.
guess. And it's like everyone thought that I was this goody two shoes, perfect rule following person. And looking back, I would say I was a good person. I genuinely cared, was kind to people. Did I break a lot of rules? Yes, I broke them all the time. I probably broke every single rule in the rule book because I care about that. No. And I knew how to get away with it too. And it's like, because the funny thing was, I was always a rule follower and a perfectionistic person until getting to Bob Jones, when it was just too much, when I
Mm,
realized this wasn't necessarily religion, but just ideology and
yeah.
things that were forced onto people to conform. And it's like, I have to be my own person. But I was honest for the first time. And I was like, no, I did not miss church. And she was like, oh my gosh. She's like,
That's
are you
so funny.
are you saved? Oh my gosh, Andrew, I'm so worried. Because you're supposed to love going to church if you
Right.
have Jesus in your heart. But anyways, and like my argument with that is like there are so many kinds of churches. Like
Right.
which one meets that criteria? It's like just because you hate going to an IFB church doesn't necessarily mean you don't like believe in quotes like
Right.
you know what I mean? It's like there's so many churches. So who are you to say like, oh, you don't like going to this one church, you must not be saved. So it's like, and I kind of got, it was my first time to actually argue with someone like about their beliefs. And for me, it wasn't necessarily about being right. It was about making her actually think through these difficult
Mm,
things that I had been looking through in scripture. And she justified all these terrible, awful things. And she justified the story of the Pharaoh in Egypt of killing all these babies. And like, did you think that was okay for God to do? She's like, oh yes, that was totally fine for God to kill all those babies. She's like, those people, they did not repent. So, and I was like, well, what about the babies? What choice did they have? And she's like, oh, well, they were born with a sin nature, so they deserve to burn in hell. She believed that babies, when they die, go to hell. This is
right.
how radical, and
And
not
deserved it because they have a sin nature, something they actively
it's not
chose. No,
it's not their choice
just
at all. Like according to the Christian doctrine, if it's if you're taking it from a literal standpoint, it wasn't that baby's choice at all.
right.
Anyways. And so I even argued that with her. I was like, well, that's not that baby's choice. I'm like, well, God created, like, according to your scriptures, your God created that baby and then sent it to hell because he was born with a sin nature that had no choice with. I'm like, it makes no sense. And and she was just kind of not sure how to deal with that. And I was like, I'm like, and then after she just justified God killing babies, I'm like, how do you feel about abortion? Like I
Mm,
went there, I was like, and she was like,
doesn't
it was
matter.
like,
They've got a sin nature. They deserve to go to hell.
yeah. And
Oh my god.
so it was like, it's funny because like it was that moment of cognitive dissonance I caused for her.
Right.
It was so uncomfortable. And at that point, she was like, Andrew, I'll put you on my prayer list. I was like, okay,
So
whatever.
funny.
I was like, and like for some reason I gave her my number. I don't know if I wanted to play with her more or whatever, or toy with her, or like, but eventually it got to the point where it was like triggering for me that she would text me every once in a while, like, oh, I'm praying for you. Oh, I'm hoping God, blah, blah, this, and this. And now at one point I blocked her phone number. I blocked her on social media. I was like, I am not dealing with this. Cause like
Right.
she actually did not want to get to know me as a person or
Yeah.
about my life or what I had been through in any shape or form.
Right.
It was
It's
just
just a
about her
project.
being right. Yeah, it was a project. It's her to force her religion and make her feel better about her beliefs and make her feel so self-righteous.
Yeah.
And at that point, after that one argument, I was like, I don't think arguing with these people is ever going to do anything,
No.
ever. And so as I worked through and dealt with, like, I struggled with mental health a lot through my teen years and always blamed for it that, oh, I wasn't trusting God enough, I was doing this or this and this. It was always my fault, which put so much blame on me. And so eventually in college, that's when I discovered that after having like my fourth depressive episode and like trying different antidepressants, that I was like, I knew deep down inside, like, there's something deeper psychological happening. I don't know what it is. And then when I finally came across religious trauma, I was like, fuck. I literally like broke down crying because it's so awful to suffer constantly and like to not know what is the issue. Because to have a solution, you have to know the problem. And it's like when I discovered that term, it was so much for me to process that I ignored it for a while. I was like, I don't even have time to process it. That's so much. Like to think that everything I had grown up in had completely destroyed me and hurt me psychologically was too much to handle at that time. You know what I mean? So it's like it took me a little bit, probably a year after hearing the term, to actually be like, I have to actually start digging into this, because I'm like, to me, it's like I can't get any worse than how I felt at that moment. So it's like you just jump into the abyss of
it's that cost benefit, right? It has to be that the pain of staying still is more than the pain of taking the jump, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it took me, I think I started writing a book since I was 19, and it was something I had never ever planned to like release publicly ever. I'm like, this is my private thing. I knew I had been through a lot, and there were so many unprocessed things in my mind, and I need to work through them. So writing, I thought, was a way to take those stories out of my mind and think of ways maybe. And I hadn't even yet. At 19, I didn't know shit about psychology yet.
Yeah.
So I was just like, okay, this will help me, and it did help me at some points, but it didn't get to the core because I didn't understand those situations and how they went deeper, and how it hurt my psychological growth and my mental health. And so I think I would say it was probably that semester of 2020 when I argued with that girl. That's when I really started digging more on the internet and researching things. And like, it was hard to do that while juggling college on the side and doing these other things. So long story short, after I made that final proclamation of faith and realized it was emotional and psychological, that's when I decided that's when I started consciously deconstructing, really deconverting or destroying. Like, I feel like deconstruction and deconversion are seen as synonymous, but they're not.
Right. Yeah.
But that's what I want to emphasize, that I decided to deconvert at that point.
Yeah.
I'd already tried for so long to get rid of the toxic things out of my faith, but like I underestimated the power of trauma, most definitely, and the effect of the mind. And so then I deconverted really to take back my autonomy and my mental health, because the Bible was used as a weapon really against me to harm me and to push me into submission. So, the Bible is very triggering to me. Usually I haven't read it in years. And like, there are still like verses that I remember of like, or teachings that I follow, like the golden rule is something I feel like there's one thing that people take, which it's not inherent to Christianity anyways.
No, it originated long before Christianity.
Long before it. So it's like,
Jesus stole it for sure.
Yes, he did. And that's when I realized that. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But sorry, what was I saying? Oh yeah, deconversion. So like, for me, it was like, okay, it's like, I need to deconvert because this religion is so harmful because of the way I grew up and the damage it's had on my psyche. It's just story and everything for me. And really, that summer is when I started digging into psychology. And now I was like, you know what? I'm going to face the monster in the closet and deal with it. And so after like 6 months of digging into psychology books, which that went from like June to December of last year, I finally like digging into psychology. My like growth grew like exponentially, like straight up. That's how it. And it's like, I figured out so many issues. Like, there were just times I'd be just reading books and just crying because I finally knew how this damaged me. And that really, I feel like for victims in these environments, they minimize and are in denial about, well, this didn't happen to me, so I shouldn't be like this. But once they actually find out, like, oh, this is actually really crucial to grow as a healthy human being, and not getting this can really damage you and cause
it's a lot
trauma.
to grieve.
It's a lot
the
to
loss
grieve.
of like a healthy childhood.
It is a lot. And like, there are still some days I'm just sitting in my house, my home, and I'm like, there's times I still grieve about the childhood I didn't get, or things that I'm like, I was a child. Why do they do these things to me? Why do they not let me be? Like, why do they take my innocence so quickly? And it's still some things. Sometimes I'm fine. Some days I'm not. Like, that's the thing about healing. It's not a linear process, really.
Yeah.
To me, it's like a roller coaster, a crazy roller coaster. And to, and and to me, it's like, you know what? It's okay if there are days I feel bad, because that means I'm still healing. Healing doesn't always mean feeling good, which I feel like that kind of toxic positivity can be around healing. And it's like, you know what? Have the resources you need. Like for me, I am a believer in therapy plus medication combined together, because there are things in therapy that are hard to work through, and they can trigger PTSD symptoms. And you know, I recently had an appointment with my doctor, and I'm like, hey, I'm working through religious trauma. Can I get on Prozac, because I heard that can help with PTSD. Like, what do you think? Or should I get on something else? So she's like, oh yeah, Prozac, that should really help you manage that as you deal with these things. And so I'm like, okay, because like for me, personally, you know, I mean, really, in truth, medication cannot heal trauma.
No.
I don't care what big pharma tells you how incredible their drugs are and what it can do for you. Medication will not make you process your memories. Your medication will not make sure that you grow psychologically. It just deals with symptoms, not the roots of the issue. And so for me, I know mental health is a complex issue. So like, I know there are people where medication is a cure because they're bipolar and they have a chemical imbalance, or they have a chemical imbalance because of depression. Like there are instances of that. It's not like, oh, all people should just go to therapy and that's the answer. No, I think medication is the answer for some people. I think therapy should honestly be something that everyone should go to, not that it will solve their problems, but that they can figure out how to solve their own problems on their own. Because that's my magical thinking that I have with therapy, is my therapist, he's not giving me the answers, he's guiding me to the answers. And he's giving me the tools that I need to heal myself. And he's guiding me on the way and helping me. And so I'm like, you know, if we could all go into therapy to help us honestly just be self-aware and to consciously work on emotions, like, not that the world would be perfect, because it never will be, but it would be a better place. And every single person in the world could learn to be self-aware and regulate emotions, the world would be a much better place.
Oh, seriously.
And like, I know, not to say that I don't want to be like dogmatic and like, this is the answer. Because the thing is, when people go to therapy, people have different problems. It's not all one issue for everyone across the board. It's different things. They're going to therapy to deal with different problems. But when hurting people do hurt other people. So when you heal yourself, you're healing other people, really. And so until our society and world can learn to heal itself individually, in which, you know, I love individualistic mindsets and collective mindsets, but I feel like we need to some way synthesize them together and not be like either or. It's like, why can't we now synthesize this together and have that balance of individual and the society as a whole, of understanding, you know, before you want to help other people, you have to help yourself and fix yourself. So kind of, I feel like that's the stage of life where I am in right now with therapy. And as I'm getting ready to study psychology, it's like, you know what, I'm like, before I jump into psychology and become a psychology therapist, like, I need to really work through a lot of shit. And psychologists are required actually to go to therapy to work through their own shit, because you don't need to bring that into your therapy session.
No, for real. I've sat down with therapists where I'm like, oh, I'm triggering some shit for you right now. Like, sorry, we should mix this up. You should not be my therapist. Yeah, for real. Andrew, man, I'm just realizing the time.
I know.
We should wrap up. This has been great. I've really enjoyed chatting.
It's been almost 3 hours, hasn't it?
How can people connect with you and follow you, reach out to you? You know,
so I am very active on Instagram And I have my link tree on Instagram, and it will have all my socials, all the different things I've done. And I have a lot of mental health resources and books in my link tree also to help people. And so on my Instagram, that's where I'm super active on. And it's Andrew Pledger, and like the A is a 4. And like the profile pic is of like a painting of me that I thought it was cool. You know what I mean?
I'll get a link to the profile so people don't have to hunt too hard for you.
Yeah, that's good. So, and like for people who want to know what I'm doing right now with my social media, I'm like bringing awareness to religious trauma and like educating people on mental health and encouraging people to seek those tools, and also like understanding the psychology and the harmfulness of fundamentalism. And like I post a lot of quotes too, just that I've kind of come up with on my own over the years that I just put down on my notes, just like that some of them can be controversial. And I think that's why some of them people love them. It's like I try to say what people are afraid to say, because now I can actually, like, I'm free from that environment. No one can really hurt me anymore. You know what I mean? So it's like I can say, and like there are a lot of people that are like, which I'm sure you've got messages too, where people are like, I'm so glad you are doing this and taking the courage to say these things. You have all these people who are against you. And like, for me personally, my page is not at all about basically saying, oh, this religion is wrong or this is false. It's not about dogma at all. It's about teaching people to find their autonomy through mental health and psychology and knowledge, really. And that you can find the answers that you want. And so, and I do have also an IGTV show called Speaking Up, which you were on recently. I loved having you on so much. It's my favorite episode so far.
Oh, wow.
Serious, because like you really helped me learn a lot more about deconstruction and like figuring out the statistics and the misconceptions and like how the Gospel Coalition has just been misrepresenting so many people.
Surprise.
Yeah. And yeah, so for me, my platform too is like, I want to give people a chance to share their stories, you know, when they're ready to do that and to process it. And, you know, one day I do plan to make it into a podcast, but like not now. Like, I don't want to be that person who's like, I'm going to do a podcast and then do 2 episodes and forget about it, because I've seen that happen so many times.
Dude, I feel attacked right now. I'm on an episode. This is probably going to be like 140 or something, but it's over like years, because I like do like a whole bunch of episodes and then I just like go, I'm bored doing podcasts, and I go back to it like 6 months later, and everyone's messaging me like, when is the next podcast episode? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm distracted right now. I'll come back to it one day.
Well, I mean, at least you come back to it.
I do come back eventually.
That's the nice thing is like, I'll look at a podcast and like, this is so cool. And like, they've had 2 episodes from like 3 years ago, and I'm like,
it's the worst, right? It's the worst. When you're like, it's like when you get into a brand new show on Netflix, and you're like, this is amazing, and then you're like, oh, and it got cancelled at the end of season 1. Damn it.
Yes. So like, good for you for keep coming back, and like, I need to listen to an episode. I know you recently interviewed the naked pastor, right?
I did,
So I'm curious about him, because he's one I followed. Like,
oh, he's amazing. You should definitely have him on.
Yes. Yeah. Awesome. But it was so good.
This was fun. It was great. I love the long form, because I was telling my wife earlier, I'm like, I love talking with Andrew, like last time we talked, but it's quite short form, and it's also like you're asking me to give like my data points and stuff. It's less conversational, and I'm like, I always love having people on, because it's just like I have no agenda here other than we just chat about random stuff and see where it goes. Like obviously people have their niches that they're educated on. You know, you think about homeschooling, you think about mental health, you know, these kind of things, religious trauma. So we're going to talk about that, of course. But there's no pressure. It's just relaxed. So I think this is really fun.
Authentic. Really, I think the authenticity is nice. But that's the struggle with my Instagram show, because like I wanted to limit to 30 minutes, and there were some people I talked for an hour and like 9 minutes.
Oh God, how long was mine? I must have talked for ages.
I can't remember. Like, it's fine if people talk that long. My fear is like, will Instagram actually upload this?
Right. Yeah. It was just like crash and just be like, sorry, it was too long. You're done.
And then it's gone. So I'm like, thankfully every episode has been able to upload. So like for me, it's like, if it gains more of a following, I'll switch to probably podcast. form probably. I might like wait a year and just see if people actually like it or not.
Yeah.
People are liking it right now, I feel like, because like they share it with their family and friends, or like, look at,
Yeah.
I share my story here. And like for me, it's just kind of giving people the microphone, I
Yeah.
guess, in a sense, letting them say, then you say, because it's like, to me, it's like the more we encourage other people to speak up, the more I feel like we can change the systemic issues, because so many people have been silent. And like if
Yeah.
we can start helping people speak up, and like I love the deconstruction movement online with all these different accounts. Like
Yeah.
with yours, and like there's what's your, I don't know to say her last name, it's like Joe
Lumen.
Lumen.
Yeah.
Lumen, okay, I got it right. I love her
Yeah. She's
so
amazing.
much. And I think, is it Andrew Curbs, the deconstruct everything? I love his
Yeah.
stuff
Yeah.
too. And I'm trying to think, there are others. There's like heretic theology or something. And of course, naked pastor. Like there's these like, and like talk purity home
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
There's,
Yeah.
and but yeah, it's just so interesting to just see, because when I started it, I was like, it was so weird to me to think of myself as an influencer, because it's not something my personality type would do. But
Right.
as people talk to me, they're like, you're becoming an influencer, Andrew, right? I'm like, what? I was like, don't say that. Like,
It's funny. I find that every day. I'm like constantly like, please do not look at me as someone that has answers. Please. Because
yes.
honestly, I get scared by any of my answers. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So some
I
people say
love
that. I'm like, to me, it's like, it's so funny, because I'm like, am I taking my pain and am I trying to be a brand or something? Like, I
it.
never thought that. Like,
Oh, every time. Every time. Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I love it. Andrew, this
yeah.
was so much fun. I really loved it. Thanks so much. We'll have you on again at some point. We'll do another chat at some
Oh,
point. It'd be good
I
fun.
would
But yeah,
definitely love to.
cool. All right. Well, catch you later. Yeah, love you, man.
All right, love you. I'll see you.
Peace.
Bye.
If you are deconstructing, there is no reason to do this alone. It can be an incredibly lonely process, but the deconstructionnetwork.com is a free resource to help you find others deconstructing in your local area. If you would like to support what I do, everything I do is for free, from talking to people for hours on end to producing resources and podcasts. It is only possible because people give generously. There's never any need to give. It will always be free, everything I do. But if you do, we do have an amazing private community group that we talk on over on Discord that you would gain access to. And we do regular audio and video chats on there as well. So it'd be great to see you in there. But of course, never any requirement. And of course, please, please, please come and talk to me on Instagram. I love connecting with people. I love helping people on their journey. If you need a safe space to process your deconstruction, I would love to connect. It's just at Phil Drysdale. Love every one of you. Peace.